Hi, I'm Karlin Borisenko. In early 2020, I was the knitting Democrat who accidentally went viral on the internet for going to a Trump rally and then left the party. I became the conservative darling, was on all the shows, traveled around the country, and then realized that conservatives were no better than Democrats. If there's one thing that I've learned, it's that both political tribes are two sides of the same coin. But it wasn't all bad. On my journey, I became obsessed with understanding the woke ideology and the culture war. I broke the story of the city of Seattle doing segregated training with its employees.
How bad has this stuff become? The city of Seattle has now put out, I'm not kidding you, this is according to Dr. Karlin Borisenko, who's an organizational psychologist. The city of Seattle asked its white employees to voluntarily spend a day off in a training about their internalized racial superiority.
I broke the story that led to the first ever federal lawsuit against critical race theory in the schools. I broke the Coke Be Less White story, one of the biggest anti-woke stories of all time. It got over 30 million views. Coca-Cola's corporate headquarters even had to change their outgoing voicemail.
Throughout the past few days, you may have seen inaccurate reporting on the content of our recently launched diversity, equity, and inclusion training program.
I exposed the schools in Burlington, Vermont for grooming middle school children live on the internet. They called me an unwoke cult leader for that. And the Vermont Human Rights Commission slandered me publicly as being a hate channel. I even got called a hero in Breitbart for exposing that the Washington Post was writing a hit piece on Christopher Rufo. I have broken story after story after story about what's going on in the public schools, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to autistic sex education, to the Department of Education in Michigan, literally training teachers all over the state how to groom children. I wrote a book called Actively Unwoke, the ultimate guide for fighting back against the woke insanity in your life. I host a podcast all about fighting back, and I'm downloading all of my knowledge to you on my Substack, karlin.substack.com. The world is a crazy place. We are literally surrounded by cults on all sides. On this show, we're going to do a deep dive into all aspects of the culture war, and I will show you the dark, dystopian underbellies on both sides. Here are the commitments I'll make to you. I will always tell you the truth. I will always bring you receipts. And if you stick with me, I promise you will see the world differently. Welcome to the cult. Please mount that like button for me and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Well, hey, everyone. Happy Thursday. Welcome to the cult. So I'm sorry to be a couple minutes late. I was dealing with nonsense on Twitter and stuff like that. I've had a really weird last 24 hours. I've had I guess maybe even a couple of weeks, really. I'm kind of just can I just tell you guys? So last night around, what was it? 11 o'clock, maybe even midnight, something like that. A couple of people that stream on Nick Fuentes' platform, Cozy, kind of badgered me into coming on their platform. You guys know I went on their platform to talk to another guy earlier yesterday, named Beardson, and that was just... It was what it was. I did a debrief video. I thought it was a good opportunity to try to put some of the ideas out there to see how much they actually understood. And it was very clear to me very quickly that they didn't understand really anything. But they really do believe they do. They believe they know everything better than everyone. But everyone has to start somewhere, and people are all beginners at some point. We used to be beginners. I used to be a beginner. There's nothing wrong with being a beginner. And so that conversation went okay. I actually got good feedback from it, not from people who were speaking up in the chat, but people who slid into my DMs later saying, I get some of the points you're making, what you're saying makes sense, stuff like that. And then last night I got invited on this other stream, and I was kind of I was working last night and I was hoping to get some stuff on the Substack, which I always say. And, I always have a bunch of things going up, and I really do have a bunch of things that are going to be going up in the Substack. But I was like, you know what? Fuck it. Like, why not try? Why not just try? Why not just see? You know, you should try. You should try everything before you dismiss like the opportunity, right? And this was a shit show. This was a shit show. And it became very clear to me very quickly that if this is the audience that I'm going to find in that community, it's not worth it. It's just not worth it. I went from believing that there was like a possibility of them, you know, being able to understand what was going on, but it became very clear to me, and it's been very clear to me all day essentially on Twitter. These are not people with the intellectual capability to understand what's going on. These are not people with an intellectual ability that extends beyond white people good, black people bad. You know, the groypers seem to think that I've never actually become aware of their little anti-white movement or the white well-being movement or the white positivity movement. That's just not true. They keep trying to educate me. They say, "Why won't you let us educate you?" It's kind of like they're a bunch of leftists, aren't they? Demanding to educate me on why they think the world is is filled with people who are just trying to oppress and genocide the poor white people, which isn't what they're doing at all. But they demand that I let them educate me, when they have not done their homework to understand that I was embedded in the white positivity movement for like basically like at least half of 2021. I spent at least 6 months embedded in that whole toxic, racist atmosphere in 2021. I know their movement probably better than they know their movement because they're children that don't actually do any homework. I understand what their argument is, and I've deemed it to be bullshit. Because what the white well-being or white positivity movement or any of these things that are overtly like white identitarian, they have absolutely no relation to anything that the left is really saying and doing. And we know that on this channel because unlike the groypers, we actually listen to people. We spend time listening to what the left is doing. I spend time listening to what the right is doing too. That's how I knew that for the briefest of moments, for the briefest time, Nick Fuentes actually was hinging into reality and had nuanced talking points and all this stuff. And now, like, I just look at a lot of his appearances on like InfoWars yesterday, and I'm like, bro, how disappointing. How disappointing. So I think that my little experiment with the groypers is over, like for real this time. I've been blocking a bunch of them today on Twitter. I tried being nice. These are not people who want to be nice. These are not people who want to be reasoned with. These are not people who care about receipts. These are not people who want to hinge into reality. These are people who want to exist in a land of confirmation bias, in which they only take in information that confirms how they see the world, which is the world is deeply racist towards white people, and they want to kill all the white people, and they want to genocide all the white people, and they want to, like, it's such bullshit, guys. It really is. But that's how they want to see the world. And the only information that they take in, bro, you're going to get blocked real quick. You think I'm fucking around? No, milk tea groyper is fine. If there are groypers that are actually open to reason, then you're welcome to stay. I'm not just going to block every groyper because they're groypers. But anyone that comes into my feed and wants to push racist bullshit that is completely unhinged from reality. I lived in that world for 6 months in 2021. and it made me clinically depressed because of how toxic it is. So, I tried to be nice. I tried to reason with them. I offered to have reasonable conversations. I offered to show receipts. I offered to walk them through it. There are a couple groypers that have joined us, like, that are open to hearing new information. I know they're more interested because they slide into my DMs under the cover of darkness asking for more information. So anyone that is actually interested in learning and listening can stay. I have no problem teaching anyone that wants to learn. But what I'm not going to do is buy into racist bullshit. What I'm not going to do is give any positive affirmation to the idea that many of these people seem to have, which is all Black people are bad and evil and stupid and are the bane of all society. I mean, it's really fucking toxic, bro. It's really toxic. And it's like they're doing exactly what the left wants them to do. And it's just too bad because I really feel like, I don't know. I feel like Nick Fuentes could be so much more if he didn't have this giant anchor of an audience around his neck. And that makes me sad because he's smart and he could accomplish so much more. And I don't agree with a lot of the things that he says, but even the points that I do agree with him on are just completely overshadowed by the amount of toxicity that has bred in his audience. And it makes me sad. It really does. It makes me sad that someone with so much potential, so much intelligence, so much ability to think outside the box and see things differently. And even if we come to different conclusions, I can respect that. I can respect someone being a dissident. But it's like when you completely unhinge yourself from reality and then start ignoring information that is all out there, it's readily available, it's right in front of you, and you ignore it because it doesn't play into the confirmation bias of your audience, that's just intellectually dishonest. I feel bad for him. I really do. I feel bad for him because I there's part of me that wonders, is he actually trying to transition and is his audience dragging him down? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. So, we're gonna do what we're gonna do, and, you know, the whole like, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is this has just reinforced, why I do what I do and why I think it's important because, you know, I'm not just making shit up. I'm not taking clips out of context. I'm not I'm not showing you things that are only meant to feed your confirmation bias. And I think I'm one of the few people out there that's actually showing what the truth is because I'm not a tribalist. I'm not on either side. I think both sides are terrible. I think both sides suck. I think that Nick Fuentes' audience is just as collectivist as the left. I mean, some might even call them national socialists. But they're no different than the left. And so it's like it has reinforced the importance of what I'm trying to do in terms of going in and showing you guys what they're saying and breaking it down and having discussions about it and teaching people how what the language means because the language is the biggest barrier. And if people do not, and this is the sad reality, guys, is, a lot of people, like, I hear from you guys like, why aren't more people watching your stuff? Why aren't more people watching your stuff? Well, the sad reality is that what I do is really, really difficult. And there are way more stupid people in the world than there are people who possess the intelligence to be able to understand what's going on and the desire to understand what's going on. You look at the audience that I've had to, like, manage from, Nick's platform from the last couple days, and you see an audience that they're not smart enough to understand what's going on. There might be a lot of them, okay, fine, but they're not smart enough to understand what's going on. We're talking, like, sub 75 IQ, like, on a good day. They're not smart enough to understand. And, you might argue, like, that's not really their fault, and it's not, like, you can't help, there are just things that you can't help, right? But why would I waste my time trying to convince people that don't have the intellectual capacity to understand what's going on? That doesn't practically make any sense, you know? I wish I wish more people were smarter. I wish more people could understand it. I just don't know, and I would be interested in any ideas that people have. I just don't know how to make this easier for people to understand. This is really, like, and this is part of, like, there's so much stuff I this is a running theme for me in regards to, like, the school stuff, in regards to, like, the infiltration stuff, and in regards to the socialism stuff, which all three of those things overlap. How do I make this easier for people to understand? How do I just don't know. I don't know how to do it, and it's like, if people don't have the intellectual capacity to understand, and they don't have the desire to understand, is there anything that I can do to help? Is there anything I can really do? No, there's not. So the only thing that I have left is to try to talk to the people who do have the intellectual capacity to understand, who do have the desire to understand. And, sometimes people, if they have the desire to understand, they can overcome a lower intellectual capacity, and that's fine, you know? I have people on my channel that say, like, "I'm really dumb, but you helped me understand this after a while," like, and they just really wanted to do it. They wanted to do it. They were curious. They had questions that they didn't know the answers to, and then they found the answers in watching it, and they were able to understand it, even though they might not see themselves as, like, the smartest person in the world or anything like that. But it's just like the people who just want to shitpost on the internet, I cannot help them. I wish I could, but anyway, I'm really disappointed. Um, I had really hoped it would turn out differently than this. I had really hoped that I wouldn't get it's so toxic, guys. All of the people who are into this race stuff, not only are they wrong, they're just flat wrong. And there's nothing that you can ever show them. There is literally they ask, "Show us receipts, show us just one thing, show us receipts, show us just one thing, show us receipts, show us," and not only have I shown them one thing, my Twitter feed right now is full with examples that they could all reference. Filled with it. Been posting stuff all day. They won't look at it. They demand just one thing, just one thing. Okay, well, here are about 75. Just show us one thing, just show us one thing. It's like it's so toxic, and it's so devoid of any sort of honesty, of any sort of authenticity. It's like they're worse than the left. And I'm just really disappointed. I'm really, 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 really disappointed that this is what was found there. I'm really disappointed. And I knew it. Don't get it twisted. I knew it going into it. I was like, what I had hoped was I knew that Nick was trying to be more nuanced in his talking points. That was very clear to me. But I had hoped that maybe in him growing up, the audience had grown up too from the last time I looked at it. You know, I know my audience has evolved with me. I know that my audience, the people who have been watching this stuff with me for, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, like, you guys are changed. We have all evolved in the course of this. And I had hoped that if he was doing more nuanced talking points, then his audience would reflect that, but they just don't. And I don't know that I don't think that he will ever be able to extricate himself from the audience that he has. And I think that's just too bad because it's like just so much potential being just flushed down the toilet for no good reason because immature, stupid people want to shitpost all day and have their confirmation bias fed all day, and it's just so sad. I hate seeing potential go to waste. It drives me crazy. It really does. So it is what it is. I gave it my best shot. I tried. If there are still groypers who want to come on this journey with us, then I'll teach you. Just if anyone is disruptive or brings ridiculous bullshit into my chat, then we'll just remove you and it won't really be that big of a deal because you'll just be gone. And but I'm serious about teaching people that want to learn and that's all that I can that's all that I can really do. So today we're going to be returning to one of our favorite channels, Red May, and this was partially inspired by the interactions that I've had with the groypers over the past 24 hours, 48 hours, whatever, because it really has reinforced like the importance of getting receipts out there so that people can see for themselves. Because I don't need people to believe me. I don't need people to believe me when I go on a show and I say whiteness means capitalism and queer is a far left political ideology that has nothing to do with trans or gay, and that they want to attack the biological nuclear family because they believe that the biological nuclear family upholds capitalism and they can't get rid of capitalism without getting rid of the nuclear family, and that's why there are all these I can't like I don't need people to believe me when I say this stuff. Because I have the fucking receipts. I have them saying it. I have them saying it on video. And the way that we get them saying it on video is we just sit our asses down and we watch a metric ton of their content. And in the course of watching a metric ton of their content, which no one else is actually willing to do, not only do we learn to speak socialist through osmosis of just consuming a lot of their content, but we also get to provide the receipts. Michael, this is not going to happen. Do you know why, Michael, this is not going to happen? Because I don't care about debunking you guys. You guys debunk yourselves. You debunk yourselves when you're you debunk yourselves when you are completely unable to have a reasonable conversation. You debunk yourselves when you are completely unable to answer basic questions. You debunk yourselves when you refuse to look at information when it's presented to you. You debunk yourselves when you act like flaming retards on the internet. You debunk yourselves when you are not capable of following basic lines of logic and thought. And I don't care about debunking you on the Jewish question or racism, because you assholes are not smart enough to understand my content. You are not smart enough to understand what's actually going on. So producing any video of this variety would be a giant ass waste of my time. And as I told you guys last night on that stream, there is nothing that I hate more than having my time wasted. This is a waste of time. This is a waste of energy. Nothing is going to come of this. So no, you won't be getting that video. Sorry if that's disappointing to you. Tayton says, as you have said before, your time is valuable. Yeah, because this is a 2-hour video. We're going to watch a 2-hour video today. Victor's going to the store to get me beer. You guys can stay for as long as you want, come and go, whatever. But it takes time. It'll probably take at least 4 hours to watch and break down a 2-hour video. Do you think my time is best used watching and breaking down and teaching a 2-hour video? Or is my time best used interacting with retards on Twitter who are incapable of understanding and following basic information? I'm going to use my time here because that's where it's more useful. Brooklyn Way, you are helping to shift culture and with awareness. I mean, I don't know about that. I pretty much think we're fucked, but at least I'm doing something, I suppose. So that's good enough. All right, let me just look in the chat real quick. Tick History does not know what he's talking about. I'm sorry. I watched a video from Tick History a couple weeks ago, and I was quite literally shocked at how bad it was. You can go back and watch the stream. I was yelling the entire time. Tick History has no fucking clue what he's talking about in any way. And if anyone recommends I watch Tick History again, I just don't even know. I just don't even know about that. So guys, here's what we're going to be watching today. We're going to watch a video from Red May from 2020, from during the pandemic. And this is an interesting video because it's called What Was Liberalism? And I just want us to look at the key moments that they've got enumerated here. They've got Adam Smith and Karl Marx. They've got capitalism. They've got the coercive force of competition. They've got amending the Constitution, the retreat of Western liberalism, liberalism is dead. So I just feel like even though this is a 2-hour video, I feel like this video is going to have a lot of nuggets in it that we can pull out. Of course, it has our favorite Philip. I learned today, I found Philip's Facebook profile today. And do you know what I learned about Philip? Guess where Philip went to school? I was not even surprised when I found Philip's Facebook profile and I found out where he went to school. Guess where he went to school? Anyone have any guesses? Pop quiz for the chat. Where did Philip go to school? Columbia! Philip went to Columbia. Philip went to Columbia. Yes. Michael, I don't think we are compatible. I really don't. I'm sorry, bro. I don't think we are. And the reason that we laugh that Philip went to Columbia is because where did the Frankfurt School set up shop in the United States when they came over here from Germany? They set up shop at Columbia University, my friends. Columbia is the most woke of all the Ivies by like a significant degree. Teachers College at Columbia University. If your kid ever has a teacher that was trained at Teachers College at Columbia University, you get your fucking kid out of their class. I'll tell you what, because they're going to be learning some woke bullshit. Teachers College is crazy, 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 crazy. So we are going to be watching this video today, but we always love to see Philip. He's not to be confused with Sean, who is the most handsome of all the Red May socialists. I also found Sean's Facebook profile today. I have no evidence that Sean went to Columbia, but I guess I also don't know where he went to school. It wasn't in his Facebook profile. But we'll keep an eye on that. We'll try to find out where Sean went to school later. Anyway, here is the description. And again, this is from May of 2020. So this was during the pandemic. So that's obviously going to impact some of the content of the presentation. But let me just read this. No masks, no ventilators, no hospital beds. Liberalism, the political frame for capitalism. It actually says that. I know it's hard to read. It says liberalism, the political frame for capitalism, keeps having a tougher time selling itself as a solution to the growing problems of the general population. Now, this is the line right here that made me interested in watching this video, because we saw this yesterday or the other day on the channel. Hang on. Well, I guess we'll never know what Nick would say about that, because Nick hasn't asked me to talk to him. Like, you guys keep telling me to talk to Nick, talk to Nick, talk to Nick, talk to Nick. Nick can DM me, and Nick has my fucking phone number. So if Nick wants to talk to me, then he is more than capable of talking to me. He doesn't want to talk to me. Like, if he wanted to, he already would have. So I'm sorry that you guys really want to see me talk to Nick, but I feel like I keep telling you the same thing. If he wants to talk to me, he can damn well fucking ask me. And if he doesn't want to talk to me, then I'm not going to badger him like you guys have been badgering me for weeks. Like, this is like really, really simple. I was open to having a conversation with him. I'm still open to having a conversation with him, but I'm not going to run after him. I'm not going to beg him. He knows how to reach me. He can reach me in any number of different ways. So if he wants to talk to me, he can fucking ask. Anyway, so the four goals of the woke left are always and forever the same, right? Gain as much power as possible, destabilize the system, attack capitalism, usher in your Marxist utopia. He can fucking ask me. I don't know, groypers, what is so hard about this? Because I feel like I've answered this question 86, like this is ridiculous. Like, I feel like I've answered this question 86 ways from Sunday. If Nick wants to talk to me, then Nick can fucking ask me. He is more than welcome to come on my show if he wants to. Or I can go on his, or whatever. I don't really care, but he needs to fucking ask me. You guys are the ones that are all like, the man has to do this, the man has to do that, the man has to do this, the man has to do that. Well, he is the man. And if he wants something from the little woman, he can fucking ask me. Well, then I guess it's never happening because I'm not asking him. That's just the way it goes, bro. You guys don't get to say the man asks when it's convenient for you and then say, no, stupid woman, stupid fat bitch, and all the other things you call me. You have to ask him. I don't have to do shit. I don't have to do anything. So, back to this. The other day we watched a presentation from, and this is why, by the way, I'm not doing this bullshit with the groypers anymore. I'm just really not. Like, this is ridiculous. The other day we watched a presentation with Henry Giroux, and in the middle of that presentation, and there's a clip on the channel now that you can go back and watch. In the middle of that presentation, what happened is that Henry said that the reason that kids are not talking to each other in school cafeterias is because of capitalism. Because the woke left never misses an opportunity to blame capitalism for all of the problems in the world. The reason that they're trying to blame capitalism for all of the problems in the world is because they fundamentally want to create distrust in capitalism, because they want to abolish capitalism, because the only way they ever get their Marxist utopia is by abolishing capitalism. So socialists will always and forever blame every single problem in the world on capitalism. Now, a lot of the times what happens is they're the ones causing the problems. They get themselves into positions of institutional power. They then use those positions of institutional power to cause problems that destabilize the system. Then they blame the problems that they themselves cause on capitalism. Then they try to use that to usher in their Marxist utopia. It's critical that you guys understand how this plays out. So go watch the clip that I posted on the channel earlier today when you get a chance if you weren't there live. But this is another. Okay, bro, if you continue disrupting my chat, you're going to be removed from it. I don't give a flying fuck if my engagement has increased if it's the wrong audience that is not open to what I am saying. You're not the right audience for me. If you're coming here to disrupt what I'm doing, to beg me to talk to Nick when Nick is perfectly capable of reaching out and contacting me if he wants to talk to me, then you are not the right audience for me. So settle down. If you keep disrupting my chat, you're going to be blocked. So they're actually doing the thing here too about blaming capitalism. So the socialists did not cause the pandemic. China caused the pandemic. All right? But good socialists never miss an opportunity to take advantage of a problem. And so listen to how they start out this description. No masks, no ventilators, no hospital beds. Liberalism, the political frame of capitalism, keeps having a tougher time selling itself as a solution to the growing problems of the general population. Oh yeah, I love attention so much that you just got blocked. Goodbye. No more disruptions, groypers. No more. So you can literally see in the presentation description, they're saying the reason, you know why during the early stages of the pandemic that we had no masks and no ventilators and no hospital beds? Capitalism. Capitalism is the cause of all these problems. That's why everything was so effed up at the beginning of the pandemic. It's all because of capitalism. That's how they undermine faith in capitalism, because they can't get their Marxist utopia unless they undermine faith in capitalism, right? Curtis, this is not how socialists define liberalism. Socialists believe that liberalism, neoliberalism are capitalism. We know that because we heard Henry Giroux saying it just the other day. I literally got a clip of him saying neoliberalism is capitalism. In this presentation description, they're saying liberalism is the political frame for capitalism. So you always have to keep in mind, on this channel, I'm interested in one thing and one thing only, and that is how the left sees the world. I'm not interested in how the right sees the world. I'm not interested in what the correct definition is. I am interested in how the left sees the world. Since the corona crisis, there have been calls for a renewal of true liberalism as opposed to the neoliberalism that has been the credo of the last 40 years. True liberalism is going to be socialism, I'm betting. Let's see if liberalism has any mileage left. Alexander Zevin's book, Liberalism at Large, examines the long history of the Economist newspaper, which since 1843 has been the most tireless, an internationally influential champion of liberal causes anywhere in the world. Catherine looks at the effect that circulates in and around the pillar of the liberal faith, the so-called free market. The pillar of the liberal faith, the so-called free market. When have we heard free market capitalism referred to it. Well, I'll just give the punchline. This is not even a pop quiz. I'll just give the punchline. Several months ago, we watched a presentation at Hofstra University. They had a whole Antifa conference. They had a literal conference, like Antifa, anti-fascist conference. And they had all these professors come in to present different parts of Antifa and all that stuff. And again, you can go back and watch it on the channel. We watched it back then. And one of the things that I got a clip of one of the professors saying is, she says, fascism is free market capitalism. That's almost a direct quote. Fascism is free market capitalism. What are they saying in this presentation? That liberalism is the political frame for capitalism, and that the central pillar of the liberal faith is so-called free markets. So, we're going to watch this presentation and we're going to talk about it and we're going to break it down, and hopefully at some point my wonderful husband will bring me beer, because God knows I'm going to need it today. And we're going to talk about it, and I think that we're going to get a lot of good vocab from this presentation. I think we're going to get a lot of golden nuggets from this presentation. If you have never watched, this is like a Socialism Saturday in the middle of the week kind of thing, just because I feel like it. If you have never watched Socialism with me before, you're in for a treat. This will give you a taste of what we do on Socialism Saturdays, every Saturday at 6 p.m. Yeah, if you feel overwhelmed in the course of this presentation, just please make sure you ask questions in the chat. Again, this is a learning stream. This is not a shitposting stream. This is not a groyper fucking begging me to talk to Nick Fuentes stream. This is a learning stream. And so I have 2 rules in my chat. Number 1, don't be a dick. Oh, my wonderful husband is here. Oh, look, for the love of beer, indeed. And he's delivered me Sam Adams Oktoberfest for this special occasion. Victor, I love you very much. Thank you. You're definitely going to get laid later. It's going to be great. Yes, yay for Saint Victor, saving the day again. So, guys, I have 2 rules on my channel. Number 1, don't be a dick. That means you do not insult me. You do not insult other people in the chat. Number 2, no whining. If I ask you to stop doing something, groypers, just stop doing it. Like, I don't want whining. I don't want complaining. I don't want excuses. I don't want any of the bullshit. This is hard enough on its own. We don't need extra bullshit attached to it. And if this is your first time watching Socialism with me, or if you're relatively new and you feel like you don't know what they're talking about, that's okay, because socialists speak in a coded language, and they do this purposefully to confuse you. And when they have low IQ people like the groypers who don't bother to look beneath the surface of what's going on, they get very confused, and then they get very fucking racist, and then they give the left exactly what they want, and then the left uses that against them, because the groypers aren't thinking 3 steps ahead of the game. They're only thinking about what's in front of them right now and feeling like poor abused victims of the world because we're white and everyone wants to genocide us, which is absolute bullshit. So, if you have questions, it's okay to have questions. It's okay to be a beginner. Just ask them in the chat and we'll do our very best to answer them. All right, guys, please do mount that like button for me before we get started. Let's just jump right into it. I don't feel like shilling today. I just don't feel like it. It's not a shilling type of day. I'm in a bad mood. We got a lot to do. All right. Let's get this party started. Hi, Philip. We love you, Philip.
Hey, everybody.
Hi.
Red May surges onward here. Tonight, what was liberalism? But before we get onto our panel, I'd like to cue you in to what else we've got going over the next few days. On Saturday at noon, bottlenecks, choke points, and supply chains with Lale Khalili, Deborah Cowan, Charmaine Chua, Sandro Mazadra, and Spencer Cox as the moderator. At 6 p.m. on Saturday, the political economy of COVID-19, Radhika Desai will give her analysis as to what's liable to happen afterwards and what is happening now economically. There will be a few responses. On Sunday at 1 p.m., Socialism After Sanders and Shelter in Place.
Socialism After Sanders? I want to watch that.
Jeremy Gilbert, Hannah Atkinson should be great. And on Sunday evening.
All right. Curtis says, I just don't understand the long-term benefit of coded language. Guys, what do you think the long-term benefit of coded language is? Anyone? Pop quiz in the chat. What is the long-term benefit of socialists speaking in coded language? I set a block trap for the groypers on Twitter, and now I'm just blocking their asses, and it's fucking great. Tayton says, justice equals... maybe. Maybe. Justice could equal the removal of capitalism. I'm going to have to think about that. I'm not on board with it yet. Restorative justice is not abolishing private property. That's not what restorative justice is. We'll talk about that another day. That's a complex topic. But that's not what restorative justice is. I appreciate the proactiveness, though, Tayton. I'm going to think about that. Justice equals the removal of capitalism. You might be right about that. All right. So Curtis wants to know, I just can't understand the long-term benefits of a coded language. Coded language is good for confusing the enemy and obtaining ignorant allies. The coded language bores you to death, so you stop listening. They can smuggle in their ideology that way. They have plausible deniability. Exactly. You can talk in front of someone and they don't know what you're saying. It's about the change of consciousness because they want everyone to speak in their language eventually. Like, it's not going to be coded language when everyone is speaking in their language. They're trying to influence culture by influencing the language, right? Get your plans out there without interruption. When you have coded language, you control the rules. It's not coded to them. This is actually an excellent point. It's not coded language to them. They understand exactly what it is. It's not speaking a foreign language to them. It's speaking their native tongue. They're trying to confuse people who may fight with them. Confusing people so they don't know what they're doing, a system of manipulation. To disrupt the system, yup, to identify each other. You guys are so good. There are so many benefits of them using coded language. Coded language serves to infiltrate and destabilize, keeps them in control of the conversation. You can change the words to suit you. That they do that all the time. They literally change dictionary definitions of words. You're right about that. They fly under the radar, so it's not in your face. To steer the dialectic towards communism, really good, Akshay. I agree with that a lot. I agree with everything everyone's saying. Let's see. Yes, Spot, you can DM me that. Well, by long term, I mean after they reach their 4 goals, then they're going to have their Marxist utopia and everyone's going to be speaking the coded language. So after the socialists abolish capitalism and usher in their ideal society, it's not going to be coded language anymore because literally everyone, they speak like this in private. They speak like this all the time. I've been to their events. They speak like this amongst each other. This is going to be the language. So it won't be coded anymore after that. Well done, guys. Really, really well done.
6 p.m. Sarah Jaffe and Michelle Chen will be back with Belabored, labor journalists. They'll be talking to Cal Winslow, who has a new book on the Seattle General Strike of 1919. And on Monday night, communism and communism or neo-feudalism, Jody Dean's rendition of updating of socialism or barbarism. So that's at 1 p.m. I'm sorry, it's not in the night. So check that one out. And then finally, Friday evening at 5 p.m. after geoengineering, Dan Denver of The Dig, Jacobins of The Dig, interviews Holly Jean Buck about her new book. So before we get...
Hang on, I've got another super chat from Tayton. Tayton says, no justice, no peace really has me thinking about justice until Tayton, you're making a really good point, and I just hadn't thought about it in this way yet. So, like, I'm not saying no, I'm just saying I just want to think about it because you're introducing a new idea to me that I haven't thought about, and I want to just let it percolate a little bit. But I think that you could be on the right track. I really do. I think it does make a lot of sense.
Started, I want to make a pitch for money. You know, our 1 month vacation from capitalism is unfortunately not free because we're in capitalism. So in order to keep this madness going, we need the kindness of strangers. So please go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org, or down to YouTube, our YouTube Red May TV section, and click on the donate buttons at each place and give what you can. And also subscribe to our Red May TV station, because we need more subscribers. So anyway, I will now turn our evening over to Michael Bray, who is a professor at Southwestern University.
Michael Bray wrote the
and is
Antifa
the
handbook.
author of Powers of Mind, Mental and Manual Labor in the Contemporary Political Crisis.
He wrote the Antifa handbook,
which is an excellent book. We're hoping it comes down
I'm
in
pretty
price
sure.
in about a year. And he is also the author of five theses on the, what's the exact title?
The title is The Virus Infects Politics. And it's actually 6. I should have said before, 6 theses on, I forget the title.
Well, there are 6 theses on the pandemic in the new Spectre Journal, a new radical journal put out by a plethora of very smart radicals like Charlie Post and Kate Del Griffiths and Zachary Levinson. So do check out Spectre. But Michael, take it away.
Thanks, Philip. I thought I'd just start briefly by just actually expressing thanks and gratitude to you and to the other folks who have helped in putting Red May together, because I don't know if folks realize, probably a lot of them do, that you all have in effect put together and organized 2 different month-long schedules of events for this May. I was very much looking forward to being in Seattle. This weekend was actually when I was supposed to be there, and I'm sorry that didn't happen. But the kind of effort you all have put in to this is just phenomenal. And what you've managed to put together in this online edition in just 2 weeks is really impressive. And so thank you to you and to everybody else involved for doing this. All right, so, and this is one of those phenomenal panels that you have put together. And so I'll just introduce each speaker as before each of them speaks. And so the first speaker is going to be Alexander Zevin. He is an assistant professor of history at City University of New York and an editor at the New Left Review. Alexander?
Great. I'm really excited to be here and to be on this panel with all of you, and to talk about what was liberalism and what it is. I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about my book, and then proceed to talk about maybe more interesting things to do with sort of historical precedents around the sort of perceived crises of liberalism and how liberalism has kind of withstood and flourished in the aftermath of those crises, and then bring us up to the present to kind of ask where liberalism will stand at the end of this present crisis with the pandemic. So, first of all, my book, Liberalism at Large: The World According to the Economist. In my book, I try to do something a little bit different with the study of liberalism.
The groypers are too dumb to know I'm setting block drops for them on Twitter now, which is so fucking beautiful.
So, liberalism is a much abused term.
Okay, listening.
And
focus.
maybe it's in second place now to neoliberalism in terms of the ways in which it is used and abused. But what I wanted to do was to sort of resist or push back against definitions that start either in the 17th century with John Locke as the kind of proto-liberal who argues, in so many words, for life, liberty, and property, and that this is the kind of foundation of liberalism. And I also wanted to push back against histories that begin in the 18th.
He wants to push back on the idea that liberalism is life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. That's interesting.
Century with Adam Smith as the original kind of liberal political economist. In my argument, in my telling, liberalism emerges at a specific moment in Europe in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, first in Spain and then in France. And and it largely has a political meaning.
Yeah, of course,
an
because they were
attempt to
Enlightenment
limit
thinkers.
the powers
agree.
of the absolute monarchies, while also resisting popular pressure from below. And so this will manifest itself in some kind of suffrage, some kind of responsible government, but also freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and so forth. The term then migrates to Britain, and in Britain, I argue there is a unique synthesis that political ideas of liberalism that emerge on the continent of Europe merge with economic maxims of free trade and the absolute right to private property in theories of limited government. And what I try to do in this different telling of liberalism is also I use a different source. I use The Economist magazine, which is founded in 1843. And I argue gives us a kind of unique way of looking at, of understanding liberalism that doesn't focus on one thinker or one theme in the history of that vast subject, but actually allows us to understand liberalism as an evolving set of questions, of confrontations, and of developments. And so the sort of structuring themes of my book are really move us away from an understanding of liberalism as sort of focused on individual liberty or freedom, whether that's in a kind of positive or negative sense, to reference Isaiah Berlin's famous formulation of that problem, and to these confrontations. And there are three. So the first is, what did liberals have to say after the 1840s about demands for democracy? Because if liberals in the 1810s, 20s, and 30s demand responsible government, that leaves open the question, responsible to whom, right? And liberals in the 19th century and into the 20th century adamantly resist, or at least liberals in my story adamantly resist the idea of one man, one vote, let alone one woman, one vote. And in the 20th century, devise ways to cope with and to limit the impact of universal suffrage when it arrives. And so in this sense, my story of liberalism is not sort of a teleological one in which liberals gradually and wisely welcome universal suffrage, but in which they resist and negotiate and sometimes outright seek to end sort of democratic forms. The second theme is the rise of empire.
Nick doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about, which is why none of you know what the fuck you're talking about, which is why you're getting put in a timeout now. And if you ever come back to my channel and try to shitpost in my chat again, you will be banned. And I don't give a flying fuck how much information you've DM'd me on Twitter, because your only goal here right now is to be disruptive. You don't know what the fuck you're talking about because you're too fucking stupid or too fucking lazy or too fucking cowardly to sit your ass down and listen. So enjoy your time out, bitch. If you come back and you keep shitposting in my chat, it's going to be the last time we ever hear from you.
What do liberals have to say about the expansion of European nation states outside of the sort of geographically defined area of the state, abroad? And in the earlier period of liberals are arguing that that empire is one of the more pernicious forms of protection. Of course, this is an argument that Adam Smith makes famous. But again, by the 1850s, in my story, liberals, especially those who are in and around the journal, The Economist, are arguing that empire can be an absolute necessity when it comes to actually stitching together a free trade world. That far from the Cobdenite idea of peace, free trade, and goodwill, free trade can actually require the use of force. And I document the way that unfolds in the Crimean War, in 1854, the suppression of the Indian Mutiny in 1857, and then the Opium Wars in China, as kind of classic examples of the ways in which people are forced to trade freely, if you will. So that's the second theme. The third theme is the expansion, the rise of, the ascendancy of finance within the global capitalist order and within British
Global
political
capitalist order.
economy in particular. So if the classical political economists regarded, were worried about land, labor, and production, the profits, the question of the what it was that finance was doing, especially finance that was being sent abroad in ever greater quantities. Britain historically sent by far the largest amount of foreign capital abroad of any nation state in history as percentage of its GDP.
Well, okay, so Kino just sent me a $5 text payment because he says that YouTube won't let him super chat this. So I appreciate the $5, Kino. You didn't have to do that. You could have just texted me. But he says, YouTube won't let me super chat this, so I'll send this to you directly instead. I'm all for weaponized autism, but the groypers are a whole new level of retarded. I mean, I kind of agree. Not all of them. I think there are good groypers. I really, really do. But some of them are a whole new level of retarded. All right. Guys.
What did liberal...
Guys, I'm sorry. I need to go to the little socialist room real quick. I should have gone before I started the stream. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop off the stream for a few seconds. I'm going to let this play. I'm going to trust all of you to pay attention for me and let me know if there's anything that I need to know. This is what happens when you get older. You have to pee like every 2 fucking hours, okay? So I'll be right back. I apologize for the interruption.
Have to say about that, and how in particular, and I think The Economist focuses our attention on this, how did they create a kind of politics that was suitable to a world in which the absolute freedom of capital, the absolute mobility of capital was a priority. So today we think of Standard & Poor's and Moody's and these other credit rating agencies. We routinely hear about what Argentina is going to do to restructure its debts, or how Italy needs to par back its ambitious social spending programs. But that is a kind of worldview that originates with The Economist, and that is something new in the world at the time that The Economist is founded. So those are the three themes of the book, and those are the ways I try to upset the apple cart when it comes to talking about what liberalism has meant and means. So I'll just quickly say I have no idea how long I've been talking. Hopefully not too long, but it's hard, when you're in your study. But I'll just say briefly that one of the reasons that I'm skeptical that we've transcended liberalism, or the variant of liberalism known as neoliberalism, or at least that's how I view it, has to do with some of the crises that my book deals with, some of the ways in which liberals have dealt with and responded to previous crises. So I thought I'd just mention two, and obviously historical analogies, this is very fraught, and I'm sometimes very critical of other historians who, mobilize what I consider to be historically inapt analogies, but these are more examples than sort of analogies. So first of all, one of the founding crises that my book, or rather plagues that my book documents is the Irish famine in the late 1840s. And The Economist and its editor, James Wilson, is absolutely instrumental in guiding the policy of the British government. By that point, he is an important secretary to the Treasury. He's elected to Parliament in 1846. And he's exchanging secret minutes with the Secretary of State for Ireland, as well as cabinet ministers and other important officials at the Treasury. And The Economist itself is attempting to guide public opinion in terms of attitudes towards what should be done in Ireland. And the paper in its original form is probably the purest expression we have of laissez-faire. And the idea that the market should be left alone to determine the optimal outcomes. And The Economist takes this absolutely as far as it can go. And for them, there should be no forgiveness of debt.
Remember, these people believe that fascism is defined as free market capitalism. That's why he's very much against the free markets.
Should be no outdoor relief. There should be no purchase of grain in the New World, or or stocking of grain within Ireland. No restrictions on the export of butter, of grain, because of course during the famine those things are being exported out of Ireland. So this is and you know, we don't have to just remain in Ireland. We can think of Mike Davis's story about the Great Famine in India in the 1870s as well. That these are two kind of classical cases, if you like, of laissez-faire ideology guiding imperial policy. And far from these crises, which resulted in millions of dead, far from undermining the ideological hegemony of liberalism, they were indeed moments that embedded liberalism and the liberal state for the long term. And that took different forms in Ireland and India. Okay, so that's sort of one example. I could say a lot more about it. I'm kind of broad strokes, but the other that I wanted to think about just very briefly was the period in the post-war Britain. This is another sort of period that my book deals with. And it stages basically the arguments between the economist as the kind of representative of liberal economic orthodoxy and John Maynard Keynes. As Keynes works his way, basically moving away from the position that he himself had grown up in as a student with the editor of The Economist at the time, a guy named Walter Layton. They had been students of Alfred Marshall, very important, very influential English political economist. And he, you know, by the mid-1920s, Keynes has begun to really profoundly question whether or not these liberal economic orthodoxies to do with the gold standard, to do with austerity and balanced budgets, as well as many other things, can help explain, let alone mitigate, the crisis that Britain finds itself in. Because after the First World War, again, this is a moment when people are starting to say liberalism has run its course. Clearly, the role of the state in allocating resources in the First World War implies the end of laissez-faire orthodoxies, right?
Oh, did you just hear that? That was subtle. He said, clearly the role of the state, like distributing resources, signaled the end of laissez-faire orthodoxy. This is the sign that they thought liberalism was dead, because the state distributed resources during the First World War. Let's listen again.
Again, this is a moment when people are starting to say liberalism has run its course. Clearly, the role of the state in allocating resources in the First World War implies the end of laissez-faire orthodoxies, right? But actually,
Kansas Mama, what don't you follow? You have to be more specific. What don't you follow? Communists, socialists, Marxists, we use those three terms interchangeably because they use them interchangeably, want the state to be responsible for all production, all resources. That's why they don't want private property to exist. They want the state to control everything. Laissez-faire is like free market capitalism. So it's like, it's basically, it's just like you let the market decide without interfering, which is the opposite of what these people want.
In the period after the First World War, we see a quick snap back. In other words, the liberal state, of which Britain is perhaps the kind of locus classicus, is able to deal with an immense amount of state involvement in the economy, rationing of credit, rationing of food, the actual control of factory production in the new Ministry of Munitions. Famously, Lloyd George heads that ministry. And yet, at the end of the war, harsh austerity is reimposed, the gold standard is reimposed, all of these things that seem rationally to have been superseded are reimposed. And so the arguments that Keynes and The Economist have go on for another decade. And the reason that Keynes, we think of Keynes as having triumphed, really has nothing to do with the intellectual coherence of his project. And this is maybe a controversial thing for an intellectual historian to say, but really to do with the force of events. And so it's not as though the general theory comes out in 1936 and that's the end, and the liberal economists have had their day. It really takes the labor movement in the Second World War and then the election of the first post-war labor government to actually affect some kind of lasting, and even then in all sorts of ways compromised change. So I actually have a lot more to say about what this means about the present moment and why it is that I'm skeptical that without some form of really strong counter movement, we've seen the back of all of these features of the shriveled liberal state or liberal political economy that we at Red May don't dislike. But I'll maybe end there, and then we can talk about it in together.
All right, thanks, Alex. Our second speaker is Catherine Chaput. She is an associate professor at the University of Nevada, Reno, where she teaches courses in rhetorical theory, argumentation, and criticism.
University professor.
She's the author of dozens of articles
institution.
and book chapters on rhetoric, political economy, and affect. Her most recent book, Market Affect, historicizes economic debates about capitalism and surmises that anti-capitalist theorists need to invent a new human sensibility to accompany their alternative economic imaginations. Catherine.
Okay, thank you. I'm excited to be part of this panel. I had several speaking engagements in May, all of which were canceled, of course, but this is the only one that was sort of reformed. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to also just sort of talk a little bit about my book. The book is called Market Affect and the Rhetoric of Political Economic Debates. Unlike others on this panel, I'm a rhetorician, so that needs a little explanation, I suppose. So rhetoric emerges basically in the 5th century BCE along with philosophy. It's more or less considered a how-to. It's a practical art, right? So it's about how to negotiate power through discourse. People practice it to retain their resources, to retain their powerful families and the powerful investments, and to convince people to do politically what is expedient for them. So as a consequence, it has a negative valence usually reserved for the sophist, the sophistry, the illusions, the underhandedness, right? But rhetoric, of course, can be used in all kinds of ways. I am not a rhetorician particularly interested in the practice of rhetoric. I am interested in theorizing what we call rhetoric. So traditionally, rhetoricians imagine that there is a sort of handbook.
Hang on. Guys, if you want me to go back to something, then hang on. It's not working again. If you want me to go back to something, you need to be more specific about what you want me to go back to, because I have no idea what you're referencing. So I'm open to taking direction from the chat, but you have to tell me what to go back to. See, Michael, I told you. See, here's the thing that you guys need to know about the groypers. The groypers have started calling me Sloppy Joe, which I don't appreciate, which is why Michael is doing it, because Michael's a little shitbag who isn't smart enough to understand what's going on. And I told you that if you did this shit again, I was going to block you. So goodbye, Michael. It's been nice knowing you. Don't let the door hit you on the way out.
And a hand list of strategies, discursive strategies for convincing people, for persuading people. And of course, those strategies have to do with logic and emotion and ethical persuasions. What is, throughout this long tradition of rhetoric, kind of on the sidelines, is the relationship between rhetoric and the body, and the ways in which bodies are drawn together and work in sort of synchronized ways. So there's a whole range of comments in rhetoric and allusions to bodies being linked together through speech, so that like literally there's something coming, these sort of chains coming out of my mouth and going into others' ears, and then through these chains I'm able to move people to and fro, get them to do my bidding. So what I'm interested in is the possibility that those metaphorical chains might actually be materially concrete. that there are ways in which bodies are really drawn together in unconscious ways that are neither about exclusively about structures, economic and political structures, nor are they about ideologies or psychologies exclusively, right? So what I want to do in this book, or
I don't
what
think
I
so.
hope
I
to
think
have
it's
done
just
in this book
it's
is
persuasion.
to offer a slightly different version of rhetoric that is more embodied, and the term I use for that is affect. I'm not entirely sure, after it's all said and done, that that's the right term. Of course, it's a sort of contested term. There's affect in the way that someone like Raymond Williams uses it, kind of structure of feelings, and that informs people like Berlant and others. And that's not quite what I mean. There's folks like Hart and Negri who talk about effective labor. And that's a little more like what I mean, but not quite, because really it seems to me that they're just pulling in reproductive labor into traditional concepts of surplus value.
They're pulling in reproductive labor into traditional concepts of surplus value. What does that mean? Hang on, I'll go back. They're pulling reproductive labor into concepts of excess surplus value. What is that referencing? Well, surplus value is capitalism. Surplus value means profit. That's what capitalism is. They believe that labor is exploited under capitalism because they need to provide surplus value to the bourgeois, but specifically reproductive labor is about children and families. Exactly. Because socialists believe that the nuclear family upholds capitalism, and that the women specifically, because of the patriarchy, are doing the oppressed labor of both literally labor, having the children, but then also raising the children, which they are not paid for by the state, because they are providing the state with future workers, which are going to create more surplus value, more profits for capitalism. Very good, guys.
There's folks like Hart and Negri who talk about effective labor. And that's a little more like what I mean, but not quite, because really it seems to me that they're just pulling in reproductive labor into traditional concepts of surplus value. And then there's other people like Brian Masumi, Teresa Brennan, Patricia Clow, who think about affect in a slightly more physiological sense. And that's more where I come down on the notion of affect. So for me, affect is literally a kind of circulating material entity that moves among people and environments, and it connects them and organizes them on a kind of non-conscious way. So it's a circulation of biochemical and physiological material. And in that way, we are persuaded, and we think of these things as sort of natural or instinctual, but there is actually something sort of tugging us along or pushing us back, right? And so I use this notion of affect, this sort of physiological notion of affect, to rethink some of the different arguments, political economic arguments, using a kind of what Said might call a contrapuntal reading, what Kenneth Burke, who's a rhetorician, would call a reading by discordance, but putting kind of unlikely pairings together. So when I say dialogues, I don't mean people who are literally in dialogue, though sometimes they are. What I mean is people who are representative of some of the key arguments in favor of capitalism and key arguments critical of capitalism in various moments. So Alex will probably give me a hard time here, but my sort of first pairing is Adam Smith and Karl Marx. So I don't necessarily make a claim that Adam Smith is the founder of liberalism, but nonetheless, he's a founder of a certain argument that gets reproduced over and over with slight differences. So I look at these two arguments, and what you find is that they both have a theory of the human being that is very much a kind of non-conscious entity. So for Smith, it has to do with theories, sentiments, and sympathy. So if I read, say, like the theory of moral sentiments as very much foundational to his later The Wealth of Nations, his later argument about how capitalism is in fact structured. And for Marx, I look at his theory of species being as fundamental to his later.
What is species being? Does anyone remember? The only other time we've heard them talk about species being was a couple weeks ago on Socialism Saturday that we did about Marx's On the Jewish Question. What does species being mean? Does anyone remember this? Species being. It means seeing yourself as part of the collective species. The Borg. Exactly, Noah. The Borg. It means the Borg, the hive. That's what it means. Social consciousness. That's another way to put it. Bees to a hive, a collective. Exactly. Well done.
Work on capital, even though people tend to think about species being as his early ideological work separate from capital. I think it very much informs how he argues in capitalism. And then I look at different moments, crises, touchstones, I don't know if you want to how you want to name them, these other arguments that get reproduced. And my argument is that there's a sort of implicit theory of affect in Smith and an implicit theory of affect in Marx, and those theories get rewritten in these historical conjunctures. So for instance, in the sort of turn to the 20th century crisis, Keynes is really reworking a theory of affect in many ways. Of course, he's reworking other theories, but one of the things he keeps going back to is the fact that the market made sense for Smith. It doesn't make sense for a global world. So that what sinks exchange is this sort of proximity. And we don't have proximity in the global world. So we need to have these sort of surrogate structures in place. And then I also look at Veblen, who has a theory of instinct with this sort of very interesting sort of evolutionary notion of instinct. And he basically argues that surplus value is this sort of illusory thing, but human beings do have this very real natural instinct toward workmanship, and that we need to use that to mobilize some difference. And then I also look at the kind of post-World War II moment. I'm looking particularly at Hayek and Adorno in that pairing. Hayek, who is extraordinarily interesting, was trained in psychology, basically, right? He wasn't trained as an economist. He wasn't trained as a political theorist, even though we think of him in those ways. He was trained as a psychologist, and he has this very interesting early book on psychology, The Order of the Mind, which to me informs his later political economic work. And what he basically argues is that there's a whole range of tacit understandings among individuals. And that's really what structures economics, and not anything that we can rationally think of.
Wait, what did she just say? What did she just say? The understanding, he argues that what structures economics is the understanding among individuals. Yeah, I picked up on that Adorno thing too, Rottweiler. Theodore Adorno, that's another high-profile critical theorist worth mentioning. That we've heard him mentioned recently too. We heard him, Henry Giroux mentioned him the other day too.
Argues is that there's a whole range of tacit understandings among individuals, and that's really what structures economics, and not anything that we can rationally think of.
What structures economics is a whole range of tacit understandings among individuals. I don't know what that means, but I'm going to keep that in mind.
And on the other hand, what Adorno does is say, like, not only is production alienating, in fact, consumption is alienating. And so he sort of extends some of the problems of capitalism that Marx points out early on to the whole of society, kind of limiting our ability to produce something else. And with a more kind of slightly more contemporary debate between Friedman and Galbraith. And the argument there is that what they've done is they took these arguments, these two different sort of positions on capitalism to the public sphere. And Friedman absolutely trumped Galbraith, not because he had a sort of more sophisticated argument or a more sound theory, but in fact he had a much more subtle understanding of what I'm calling affect, these sort of relationships among people. And so at the end of the day, what the book argues is that capitalists, unlike their critics, have a kind of implicit, I'm not arguing that this is something that they're consciously doing, but they have a much more implicit understanding of the ways in which human beings are mobilized effectively, what I'm calling affect here, but I'm thinking specifically of kind of non-conscious relations among bodies, than their critics, and they were able to sync those relationships to a political economic structure. So
she's basically arguing that Adorno says that capitalists were like wizards that could beguile the proletariat to oppress them, to create excess profit for them, to support their bourgeois lifestyle. It's like, you're a witch, you're a witch, you're a witch, you're a witch.
So if we want to critique it, my position is that we have tried ideological critique. We've tried raising consciousness, and as folks like Zizek and Jody Dean tell us, the symbolic inefficiency, right? This doesn't work. People are not convinced by arguments, or people might realize these arguments and act contrary to them nonetheless, right? So there's also obviously structural changes we can make in the environment, and I think that we should do both of these things: raise consciousness and change structural relations. However, I think they're both inefficient or insufficient, maybe not inefficient.
What does she mean when she says change structural relations? She said we should both raise consciousness and change structural relations. One of the ways that socialists are going to bring about their little Marxist utopia is not through, like, the right now is like, decolonization means violent revolution, decolonization means violent revolution, because they're obsessed with what's going on in Palestine, because they want to kiss the asses of Israel, and so they're trying to paint everything that's going on in Palestine as the same as Black Lives Matter in the United States, which of course it isn't at all the same thing. Because socialists in the United States are not trying to decolonize the United States through violent revolution. They're not opposed to violence. They'll use it if they have to. But the way that socialists want to architect their Marxist utopia is literally by creating structural changes to the system that will push the population unconsciously towards Marxism before anyone even knows what's going on. Socialists are not going to get their Marxist utopia based on violent revolution and decolonization of the land. That's not what's going to happen. They're going to decolonize the institutions, which means remove capitalism from the institutions. They're going to decolonize it by making structural changes, not just structural changes to society in terms of like 15-minute cities, like things like that, but also structural. They use structural changes to society to impact how we relate to one another. So the whole thing behind, like, we've talked a lot about how like we have several clips of Sophie saying that they want to get rid of people's private kitchens, and that people aren't even going to want their private kitchen because they're going to want to go to the communal area to get food, and all the food will come from the state, and everyone's going to get their food from the communal area, so they won't even need a private kitchen in their home anymore. That's a structural change. That's about architecting society so they have communal areas are built into society for places for people can go and get food because they want all food to be provided by the state. It's also a structural change in that, I wouldn't surprise me if they're going to create houses, apartment buildings in which there is no private kitchen, or it's like one of those things where like you have an Airbnb where you don't have a full kitchen, but maybe you have like a toaster oven and a coffee maker and like maybe a little mini fridge, and that's about it. Like they're going to actually structurally architect society, but it's not just about the physical structures. It's also about when you architect society around making the consumption of food be communal within society, where like everyone has to go to the big canteen, the big cafeteria in order to get lunch, right? What happens when you go to the cafeteria in order to get lunch? Well, you start developing new relationships with your comrades because you're all sitting at the same table, so you might as well chat while you're eating lunch, right? So that's what we're talking about. That's what she means when she says structuring relationships. It's not just about structuring the physical architecture of society. It's about using the physical structure of society to structure the social relationships within the society to slowly and gradually move everyone from perceiving themselves as an individual to perceiving themselves as part of the collective. Does that make sense? This is something that Emmy O'Brien talks about at the beginning of her book. Their book. I think Emmy O'Brien's non-binary. Emmy O'Brien is like Sophie Lewis's best friend. They're both abolished the family socialists. Emmy O'Brien has a new book out that I think is literally called Abolish the Family, Communizing Care, or something like that. And I heard the introduction to Emmy O'Brien's book at the Socialism Conference because she read it. Well, they read it, whatever. And she literally talks about this. She talks about the fact how they use communal food preparation, which they're going to say that's communizing care. They use communal food preparation to change the structure of relationships in society. This is what 4D chess looks like, guys. This is what the long game looks like. Not this bullshit that the right is doing with reacting to every single stupid, retarded, boneheaded thing that the left does. Like, these people are actually changing the way our entire world functions bit by bit, slowly, over the course of time, so that we don't even notice that it's happening until it's already done. That is what decolonization looks like, not violent revolution. That's what decolonization looks like. Rottweiler says, Dr. K, it's even worse than that. Communal gathering means better monitoring to curb wrongthink. Yes, it does. There will be a commissar eavesdropping on everyone in the communal kitchen and food court. You're not wrong, Rottweiler. Not wrong at all.
They're both inefficient or insufficient, maybe not inefficient, maybe inefficient too, but certainly insufficient. And what we ought to be thinking about are different practices of cultivating these intra-bodily relationships. And for that, I end up going to Foucault. And I go to Foucault in his last...
Who is Foucault? Pop quiz for the chat. Who is Foucault? Who is Foucault? Who is Foucault? Who is Foucault? Anyone, anyone, anyone? Who is Foucault? I know Rottweiler knows the answer to this. I'm sure other people do too. A pedophile! Yes, he is. Yes, he is. Foucault is a pedophile, but what else is he, Rottweiler? A little bit more productive, please. A French douchebag. Yes, he is a queer theorist. He is not just a queer theorist. Foucault, along with Judith Butler, is the godfather of queer theory. Queer theory! Exactly.
3 annual lectures where he talks specifically about practices of ascesis and paresia and the ways in which human beings have to engage in certain kinds of embodied work as well as intellectual work to constitute themselves differently. And of course, when anyone's writing a book and they get to the end, they want to wrap it up really quick, which I think I did as well. And now looking back on it, I think, okay, that was a pretty. I agree with my conclusion, but I think it's a pretty white conclusion. I'm really relying pretty heavily on.
She has a pretty white conclusion. And she's upset that she has a pretty white conclusion. Wow.
Foucault, and not thinking about a whole range of other thinkers that I think could help me out in this regard, the sort of constituting a new human subject, a new human being. So people like Alex Wahalia, people like Sylvia Wynter, people like Mel Chen even maybe, have, I think, a similar understanding of the ways in which human beings can be constituted, but with a little bit more attention to difference. The problem with my conclusion, I think, is that it can be read as sort of universalizing in a way I don't mean for it to be universalizing. So that's my project really, is to try to convince folks to think about the non-conscious relations between bodies in ways that don't rely on, say, a traditional psychoanalytic tradition, but take up these other kinds of theories, of which there, a whole range. So I think I'm just going to leave it at that.
All right, thanks, Catherine. The third speaker is Aziz Rana. Aziz is a professor of law at Cornell University and the author of The Two Faces of American Freedom. His current book manuscript explores the modern rise of constitutional veneration in the 20th century and how it has influenced the boundaries of popular politics. Aziz?
So first, I'd just like to say thank you to Philip and to all the organizers. It's really a pleasure to be here, even if virtually, and also thank you to Michael for moderating our panel and for all of the introductions as well. So I too am working on a book called Rise of the Constitution that's about the role of constitutional veneration in the 20th century. And I'd like to just spend my time kind of thinking about the Constitution's relationship to American liberalism. So there've been many disorienting things about the last few years.
Remember, American liberalism is capitalism.
And certainly one of the things that's really striking about contemporary American politics is the shift in popular sentiment to the Constitution. So if you grew up in the US, really any time in the last half century plus, really going all the way back to the 1950s and 60s, you would have grown up with a very specific story of the Constitution, namely that it's a document infused with genius, where you should revere the founders, the 18th century founders. And this is something that would have been, hammered home from politicians, on the news, commentators, at school. But now increasingly, there's a sense that the constitutional system itself is marked by really profound weaknesses, especially anti-democratic elements that we can get into a little bit more, maybe also in Q&A. that make it.
What do they mean, anti-democratic elements? What do socialists mean when they say anti-democratic elements? Does anyone get any ideas? These people are so fucking tricky. It's like, what do socialists mean when they say democracy? Dissidents. Anti-democratic means not socialism. Not socialism. Not socialism. Anti-communism, not Marxism. Exactly. Opponents to their socialist democracy. Dissidents. Exactly. Exactly. Well done.
It very difficult as an order to actively implement popular policy.
Rottweiler says, hang on. Democracy to a socialist is unity, conformity, collectivism, solidarity, comrades, the freaking Borg. Exactly. Anytime you hear socialists use the term democracy, they mean fucking socialism. Anti-democratic means anti-socialism.
And meaningful transformative change. And this is actually a really significant development, the sort of shift in perspective about the Constitution. And there are many reasons why it's significant, but for our purposes, what I want to focus on is the way in which this has real meaning for American liberalism. Constitutional support, constitutional veneration has been at the heart of the romance of American liberalism in the US. Its ideological justifications, the narrative that American liberals tell about the country and its meaning, the kind of project and sense of purpose, mission that motivates folks like Obama, Bush, Clinton, Biden. And maybe it's actually useful right now to give just a quick definition of what I mean by American liberalism. Really, I'm thinking of a few different related elements. The first is the idea that the US has been free and equal from the founding. And American history is really the unfolding of a kind of an initial project of liberal equality and its steady completion over time, a kind of progressive history that also makes the country exceptional, distinguishes it from European rivals.
Oh, this is going to be good.
There's a second element, which is a real commitment to American global power, to empire, and to the idea that American interests are the world's interests. And so the US has a right to project its power abroad. So justifications for the American century. And then let's say the third key element is capitalism. The idea that market capitalism goes hand in hand with the institutions of representative government, as well as with both domestic.
I need to go back on that one. Sorry, I was looking at my knitting. I apologize. Oh God, now I'm gonna get a phone call. Go away, phone call.
As a right to project its power abroad. So justifications for the American century. And then let's say the third key element is capitalism. The idea that market capitalism goes hand in hand with the institutions of representative government, as well as with both domestic interests and global interests. And the Constitution has been at the core of each one of these moves. So the defense of exceptionalism, of empire, and of capitalism. Exceptionalism. The thought is that really the American founders, through a kind of science of constitutional construction, of constitutional politics, essentially solved the problems of politics itself. They created a near ideal version of representative democracy that could be replicated both at home and abroad. And in this way, the idea of the US as exceptional is closely bound to the constitutional project, empire. What is it that the US is supposed to be promoting abroad? It's its vision of
Come on.
Of American power. It's why American interests are the world's interests. And that's precisely because what the US promotes overseas is a vision of constitutional order. Capitalism. It's presumably the connection between constitutionalism, democracy, and market capitalism that serves to justify market capitalism itself, precisely because of the perceived linkage between representative institutions, rights promotion, and market capitalism, that you have strong defensive of American-style capitalism. And so, to the extent today that the country is sort of dealing with problems of constitutional failure, that really means the country is dealing with a kind of exhaustion in the romance of American liberalism itself.
That means capitalism. Their argument, and remember, they're going to get to, like, should we just, like, get rid of the Constitution or amend the Constitution later in this talk? They're literally saying the failure of American democracy is the failure of capitalism. Is everyone getting that? The American Constitution has failed us. You know, the American Constitution is inextricably linked to capitalism that has caused all of these problems. Everyone is suffering because the Constitution is inextricably linked to capitalism, and therefore, do we need to amend the Constitution to get rid of capitalism?
Constitutional failure is the failure of American liberalism. And so that produces a very specific moment that we're kind of working through. And I'd like to spend the rest of my time actually kind of thinking a bit about the historical contingency of the rise of Constitution worship and the romance of American liberalism, and then what to make of this present period, really after the collapse of the kind of self-justifying narratives of both Constitution and nation. Okay, so let's just begin in a sense by going back in time to a century ago. If we were having a conversation about the Constitution really any time between the 1880s and the 1930s, it would look very, very different. Rather than this presumption about the genius of the founders and of the constitutional model, the conversation would instead be marked by profound disillusionment about the structure and the rights provisions organized through the constitutional system. And there are two really profound reasons. Reason number one was the Civil War. It's hard to talk in glowing terms about the Constitution when the Constitution essentially failed as a way of staving off national cataclysm. And for many folks that were associated with, you know, radical Republicans in the late 19th century, with racial reforms, the Constitution is an embodiment of a set of compromises around the issue of slavery that sustained both slavery as an institution and white supremacy. So there's a critique.
Everything you hear about so the reason that the groypers are so convinced that these people hate white people is because they use the term whiteness to mean capitalism, right? The reason they use the term whiteness to mean capitalism doesn't go back to what the actual definition of like a white supremacist is, which is someone that hates someone based on the color of their skin or their ethnicity or like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's not what they're talking about, because you got to remember, these people are collectivist. They view everything in terms of the collective. They view everything in terms of the system. So if you're talking about like a white supremacist that actually like hates people based on the color of their skin, that is individual. These people don't believe in individualism. They would never view that as white supremacy. What they view as white supremacy is the system of capitalism, the system that the United States was built on, which they believe that capitalism is responsible for the evils of slavery in the United States, because the evils of slavery, when white people before people in Europe brought black slaves over to the United States, they weren't considered white. Okay? What these people teach is that white people did not call themselves white until they came to America. Whiteness was invented in America in 1619 when they brought the first black slaves over, even though that's not historically accurate, but that's not the point. We're talking about what they believe. And they said that prior to them bringing the slaves to America, white people would call themselves based on their nation of origin. So they call themselves English or Irish or French or German or any of these other things. But when they came to America, they became white because they were creating a contrast with black, which represented slavery. Slaves also represent private property. And thus, systemic racism was born, because all of the white private property owners, in order to make sure the black property was oppressed and was kept in servitude, they created systemic racism in order to prop up the interests of the white private property owners. This is the connection to race. This is why whiteness means capitalism, which they say was invented in America because white people who only consider themselves white once they came to America, brought black slaves to America and kept them as private property. This is the only connection to skin color that exists in the world that the left cares about. Okay? So anything beyond that, and they're also arguing it in terms of the system, this whole idea that white people created systems to oppress black people, that they're talking about systemic racism. Everything else was built on top of that. So the perfect equitable society that socialists are going for would eliminate all disparities, which means they need to eliminate and overturn the system, which means they need to abolish capitalism. This does not matter. You see, you guys make the mistake of trying to obfuscate what the left thinks with reality. This makes no difference at all to the argument. The groypers do this shit all the time. They do this shit all the time. They try to obfuscate the argument that the left is making with reality, or their really distorted kind of racist bullshit reality that they've created that only exists in their head. Reality doesn't matter. We're not trying to debunk them. That's not the point of this. The point is to understand their perspective, to understand how they define things, to understand how they see the world. Well, this isn't even an evolution, Noah, because they've been talking about the Jew in relation to capitalism forever, but that's not the point right now. So does everyone understand the origin of systemic racism and why the left uses the term whiteness to mean capitalism? Does everyone understand this? Because I really want to put this issue to bed. I'm tired of it. I thought we had a general understanding, and then I all of a sudden had a bunch of like racist teenagers in my feed pretending they don't understand. Does everyone understand this? Because this is important. This is foundational. If you don't understand this, you don't understand the left. Cool. So what they say is, prior to bringing slaves to America, Yasmin, that white people would identify by their nation of origin. So they wouldn't call themselves white. They would call themselves English, Irish, et cetera, whatever their country of origin was. All right. Looks like people understand. Well done.
Critique of the Constitution that's tied to the Civil War. But then there's a second profound critique that's a product of industrialization in the late 19th century. So the late 19th century, late 20th century, the so-called Gilded Age, is marked by profound conflicts between labor and business. And that these conflicts end up shaping collective institutions, where the main thing that working people have is the right to vote, a vote that's cabined in lots of different ways. We don't have actually anything like universal suffrage during the period, or frankly, even today. And yet even that power is constrained by the fact that up and down the political and legal order, you have business elites that are able to use veto points to essentially undermine the implementation of popular policies. And the most extreme examples of this are unelected federal judges that can strike down a popular labor legislation. Now, these realities, both the Civil War reality and the reality of industrialization and the ways in which it's heightening class conflicts, and yet in a political context in which the constitutional order facilitates rule by economic elites, leads to the emergence of a new, quote unquote, progressive era conversation about the Constitution.
Hang on, I got a super chat from Rottweiler. Thank you, Rottweiler. It's worth mentioning this, but it's the reason why India is getting queered real fast now, because they're blaming capitalism for the caste system. I mean, Isn't that interesting? One of our favorite queer Marxists of all times, Violet, was from India. That makes sense to me. Thank you, Rottweiler. I'm not going to delve into Indian politics right now because that's just way too confusing for me on top of all the stuff I'm already doing, but I appreciate the update.
It's especially situated in the Socialist Party, but not just in the Socialist Party.
You don't
and it's
say.
built on a systematic
You
critique
don't
of the
say.
Constitution.
Hang on. I need to go back to this. What is situated in the Socialist Party? A conversation about the Constitution?
It's heightening class conflicts, and yet in a political context in which the constitutional order facilitates rule by economic elites, leads to the emergence of a new, quote unquote, progressive era conversation about the Constitution that's especially situated in the Socialist Party, but not just in the Socialist Party. And it's built on a systematic critique of the Constitution. And there are three key elements of this critique. And this is a critique that was wide-ranging and in many ways defined a kind of counter-narrative of constitutional meaning. The first critique is about the actual structure of the Constitution. And the argument here is, if you look at the American constitutional order, certainly in the 1890s before the direct election of the Senate, but even following that, there was only one half of one branch of government that's directly elected, the House of Representatives. The rest is indirectly elected, so that's the Senate, the president with the Electoral College, the federal judiciary that's entirely unelected. And that suggests that the entire structure of the constitutional system is really built on principles of counter-majoritarianism meant to constrain mass democratic energy. And that one of the central additional elements of this is it's all then facilitated.
The entire Constitution is built on keeping down the socialists and their mass democratic energy, is the argument that he just made.
This sort of constraint on mass democratic energy by federalism, the fact that the dominant political unit is the state, and the state has no direct relationship to actual.
Oh no. Oh no, come back.
What has the state primarily done? Argument of black radical and radical socialists. It primarily operated to sustain white supremacy in the former slaveholding states. Argument number one is about the undemocratic structure.
Oh,
Argument number two is about the symbol of the Constitution.
Hang on. He just said it. Black radical and black radical socialists, something about cementing white supremacy in the slave-holding states. That's as a result of systemic racism.
Primarily operated to sustain white supremacy in the former slaveholding states. Argument number one is about the undemocratic structure. Argument number two is about...
So he just argued that the Constitution, which he believes that the Constitution is innately linked to capitalism, the Constitution cements white supremacy in the former slave-holding states, which are the origin point of America's fundamentally inequitable society, because slavery what the evils of slavery were as a result of the oppressive force of capitalism.
The symbol of the Constitution. The symbol of the Constitution goes like this. In Europe, feudalism was sustained by symbols of church and crown, like the classic aristocratic symbols. That's not the way that feudalism effectively is sustained in the US. Instead, it's by the symbols of republicanism itself. And there's no greater symbol than the Constitution. And the reason why is that the Constitution is best understood not as an embodiment of the revolution, but as a counter-revolutionary document a decade later that was implemented to curtail and limit popular energy. So this is one of the reasons why...
The Constitution was a counter-revolutionary document. When he says revolutionary, what does he mean? He's literally arguing that the Constitution was written a decade after the revolution, specifically with the purpose of quelling all future revolution. This is fucking great. I love this guy.
Why social...
Come on.
Originalists. They wanted to go back to the founding meaning. Oh, I'm sorry. So it sounds like I'm freezing up a little bit. So I'll try my best. It just might be the connection. So that, can everybody hear me? Folks that are listening? Yeah. So that socialists basically made an argument that you have to look at the intent of the founders, and that the founders were committed to constructing a constitutional order that constrained popular democracy. And so the symbol of the Constitution—
Remember, popular democracy means socialism, because these people believe that fundamentally everyone is a socialist. They just need to be made aware that they're a socialist. So they're saying that the founders who are the bourgeois, remember, the founders, bourgeois, private property owners, okay? Any of them that own slaves, they're the bourgeois because they're literal private property owners, okay? So the founders created the Constitution specifically to keep down any social social kind of like upstart movement that would be designed to overthrow the bourgeois.
As a Republican emblem is actually operating to check and contain democracy. And then there's a third argument. And the third argument was that the heart of American liberalism, now this is even going back to the late 19th century, early 20th century, is built on depoliticization, and in particular, separating process and substance, saying that what we should argue about in politics are a set of contained issues, the substantive policies, but what we should not argue about are the procedural structures within which those issues are debated. And what socialists argued was that you cannot separate process and substance, that the process actually determines not just the agenda, but the possibility of meaningful change as implemented by policy. And moreover, the role of the courts, precisely because the courts were controlled essentially by a business elite, is that
bourgeois, business
even
elite, bourgeois.
When you actually are able to implement transformative policies, you still have a
Transformative policies
judiciary
means
that has a
socialist.
final veto point to check it, so that there can be no distinction between process and substance. Both have to be overcome. And
So he just said that the bourgeois still control the judiciary. So even if you're able to get transformational policies through the legislator, transformational means socialist, it means revolutionary. They want to transform society. So even if you were able to kind of get those laws through, they would just be struck down by the bourgeois judiciary. The elite. Elite is another term for bourgeois.
they need to be overcome through an insurgent mass movement on behalf of democracy itself, committed to abolishing the Senate, restructuring the courts, but also implementing things like a guaranteed job, an 8-hour day, collective bargaining, a constitutionally protected right to strike. There was no perceived contradiction between socialist constitutionalism and anti-capitalism. So that in order to overcome capitalism, you had to have a commitment both to constitutionalism and to democracy together. Now, what happens in the US is really twofold, and I'll try to cover this more quickly since I only have a few minutes left, is that you have two decisive historical moments, the New Deal and the Cold War.
Oh, shit.
The New Deal is a partial victory of these radical voices, in particular of the labor movement, because it's a moment where the labor movement has the institutional power, both politically, but also in bringing like the productive life of the country to a halt, to be able to actually, through votes, produce the kind of supermajorities that could implement meaningful policy changes, and then, transform the nature of the courts through sustained supermajorities for the Democratic Party.
Oh,
this is what's
shit.
able to generate a limited welfare state, and then also can push back against some of the conservative efforts to more systematically repeal it. And
Well, that was a total mask off moment. Wow. So they consider the New Deal to be one of those moments where they effectively gained enough political power in order to be able to jam through their policies. I mean, we knew that, we knew the New Deal was socialist, but it's funny to me to hear them say that out loud. Let's just listen to that bit again. That was a crazy mask off moment right there.
Cover this more quickly since I only have a few minutes left, is that you have two decisive historical moments, the New Deal and the Cold War. The New Deal is a partial victory of these radical voices, in particular
Radical
the
means
labor
socialist.
because it's a moment where the labor movement has the institutional power, both politically, but also in bringing like the productive life of the country to a halt, to be able to actually, through votes, produce the kind of supermajorities that could implement meaningful policy changes, and then, transform the nature of the courts.
And that's why FDR wanted to stack the court, because they viewed the courts as controlled by the elite bourgeois that were just going to strike down all their radical transformational policies. That's why FDR wanted to stack the courts. Guys, has anyone heard anyone in the Democratic Party talking about stacking the courts since Trump put a conservative majority on it? Am I sniffing glue? Has anyone heard of any Democrats talking about stacking the court? Not only since Trump put a conservative majority on it, but they also repealed Roe v. Wade. Yeah, there were an awful lot of Democrats talking about stacking the court, weren't they? Fundamentally changing the very nature of our system, making structural changes to the system, which is how socialists accomplish everything, not through violent revolution, through structural changes to the system. Oh, we're not getting our way, then we must need to just change the nature of the entire Supreme Court. This is how you learn to identify when socialists show up in the wild, by listening to socialists. Yep, socialists also hate the Electoral College because they think that it's going to damper the chances of their radical socialist revolution, which it does. Which was the point, of course.
Through sustained supermajorities for the Democratic Party. This is what's able to generate a limited welfare state, and then also can push back against some of the conservative efforts to more systematically repeal it. And interestingly, this victory is a kind of defeat for the radical agenda, because it seems to legitimate the constitutional order. Things can be changed through the means of the American constitutional system. But really, this legitimation shows the weaknesses. It required massive supermajorities, rolling supermajorities, just to sustain relatively small-scale social welfarist changes. And indeed, it highlighted the extent of social dislocation necessary for meaningful change within the existing system. And then there's a second significant moment, which is the Cold War. So what the Cold War does is, by focusing American politics on an external enemy, it moves both left and right to a kind of compromised middle ground that generates greater willingness to conciliate on issues of race, on issues of economy, and also that changes the nature of the courts itself, where the courts become a site for this kind of sustained middle consensus, the so-called New Deal consensus. And at the same time, the example of the Soviet Union and of authoritarian versions of socialism end up delegitimating more radical forms of democratic politics, where American liberalism seems to be the only feasible example of democracy that marries.
Hang on, Kyle says, did you catch that? Seems he's saying there needs to be a restructuring of the Constitution so that it aligns with the principles of socialism as guiding leadership. That's exactly what he's saying. Later in this presentation, they are going to talk about restructuring the Constitution. So that's exactly what he's saying.
Is constitutionalism with democratic principles. It becomes the single model. Now, what we have today is a moment, really, after the collapse of the institutional power of labor, which is a long story, and after the Cold War, where over a series of decades, the basic social conditions that made American liberalism, and here this is really Cold War liberalism, both meaningful and sensical as a mode of thinking about collective life, that justified Constitution worship, justified the narrative of romance around the American project. All of those elements have now increasingly collapsed, and you're left with the internal ideological weaknesses. And so that's in a sense where we are. We're at a moment where we're sort of stuck with the kind of contingent circumstances under which constitutionalism in the US could succeed. And so a recognition of its more profound failures and of liberalism's own exhaustion. But a liberalism, especially in the Democratic Party and sort of the centrist wing of the Democratic Party, that might be intellectually exhausted, ideologically exhausted, but has profound institutional power. And so the question really of the present is, in a time when left ideas and the ideas that were so dominant from, let's say, the 1880s all the way to the 1930s are back on the table again, including the notion of an insurgent mass movement committed to cross-racial, class-conscious politics that would produce truly revolutionary reforms that would alter the existing social order. To the extent that those kinds of ideas are now back on the table, what to do about implementing them without necessarily having the same kind of institutional strengths. But there's a real benefit to the present, which is, for the first time really since the 1940s, there's the thought that you could actually have a majoritarian politics, a politics of more than half of the people in this country actually committed to meaningful constitutional change, to these types of democratic alterations. In other words, there's no reason to think of radical politics as incompatible with either constitutionalism or majoritarian democracy. And instead, it's becoming increasingly apparent that the appropriate linkages between constitutionalism and democracy, and both in a deep sense in confrontation with capitalism. So I'll stop there.
There it is.
Thanks, Aziz. Our final speaker needs no introduction, really, but I'll give him a short one. Philip Wolstetter is one of the curators of Red May and a founder of Invisible Seattle. He is the author of Valparaiso, a Requiem in 7 parts, a work in progress. Philip? Oh, and sorry, Philip, before you start, if I could just say to those listening, please, as we move through the last presentation, begin to think about questions that you'd like to pose to the speakers.
I cannot wait for the Q&A.
And I'll read some of those after they finish, and we'll have a discussion. Sorry, Philip, thanks.
Oh, thanks. So I want to start with 2 quotations. The first one,
I think
by a man.
I think this has been the first time that we've ever actually heard a presentation from Philip. Normally, Philip is just playing host. This is very exciting. I want to see inside Philip's mind.
Named Louis Rougier, which is delivered at the Walter Lippmann Colloquium in Paris in 1937. To be a liberal is not like the Manchesterians to allow cars to drive in all directions at whim, the upshot of which would be an incessant traffic jam and accidents. It's not like the central planners to assign each car its hour for setting out and its itinerary. It is to impose a highway code, while accepting that it is not necessarily the same in the era of fast transport as it is in the age of stagecoaches. Second quote, this one from Chicago economist Gary Becker, inventor of the concept of human capital, a key exemplar of high neoliberalism in Foucault's lecture series on the birth of biopolitics. A crime, says Becker, is any action which makes an individual run the risk of being sentenced to a penalty. Foucault's comment, for Becker, there's no difference between an infraction of the highway code and a premeditated murder. As a rational maximizer, one calculates the risk-reward or cost-benefit and decides whether or not to break the law. My question, how do we get from quote number 1 to quote number 2? Or in other words, does it make sense to talk about the difference between what we might call the primordial vision of neoliberalism and actually existing neoliberalism? And what I want to say here, parenthetically, is that I want to talk about both liberalism and neoliberalism, because I see them as being equally hostile to democracy, and the notion of liberal democracy is a kind of oxymoron. So I think I agree both with Aziz and Alexander. We'll discover that in discussion. And I think the main difference between neoliberalism and liberalism is its effective economy, which I can link with some things that Kathy says. So onward. I'm going to use 2 opposed methods to try to answer this question. First, genealogy in the style of Nietzsche and Foucault, and second, a conceptual analysis a la Hegel. But first, let's back up and put the initial quote in context. The Walter Lippmann Colloquium was an informal 4-day conference that came together in Paris to discuss a book by American political journalist Walter Lippmann, the founding editor of the New Republic. The book, The Good Society, drew praise from Hayek and von Mises in Austria, from Ordo liberals William Röpke, Alexander Rustow, and Walter Eucken in Geneva and Freiburg, from a diverse collection of businessmen, philosophers, industrialists in France that included Raymond Aron. They were liberals and they were miserable. Everywhere they looked, they saw a turn to planning, fascism, socialism, communism, Keynesianism. They were looking for something to rally the troops, a way to renew what seemed in the 30s to be a dying ideology. So what did they see in Lippmann's book? The first half reads like a preview of Hayek's Road to Serfdom, gradual collectivism, the theory of democratic collectivism, the intellectual ascendancy of collectivism, the collectivist counter-revolution, the failures of planning. It's not worth the read. But the second half is kind of interesting. Under titles like The Debacle of Liberalism, he critiques latter-day liberalism, which he defines as Manchesterism, his term for market fundamentalism and the ideology of laissez-faire. He holds these epigones entirely responsible for liberalism's crash and burn. He argues for social insurance, infrastructure and educational spending, public lands, government inspection and regulation, and against monopoly rents from land or natural resources. Better, he destroys the intellectual infrastructure upholding laissez-faire. His argument, the notion that there are two fields of social activity, one under the sway.
Well, it's just become very clear to me that the groypers hate capitalism because they think that capitalism was created by the Jews. And so I think that that's kind of like our final parting shot of understanding that these people are not capable of understanding basic concepts. Just breaking news.
Of law, and one called the economy, subject only to the laws of nature, is a grotesque error. Capitalism developed in the context of law and not in the free realm of nowhere. All freedom, all rights or property are sustained by some kind of law. So the question should never arise whether there should be laws here and no laws there, but only what law shall prevail everywhere. So some quotes here. While the latter-day liberals were gravely concerned what the jurisdiction of the law ought to be, the jurisdiction was at all times universal throughout the economic order. By virtue of that jurisdiction, there was property, there were corporations, there were contracts, rights, duties, and annuities, there was money with which to exchange goods and services, there were standards of weights and measures, and so forth. Or this, the latter-day liberals had a vague notion that they must regard private property as approximating, to use Blackstone's words, that sole and despotic dominion which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world, in total exclusion of the right of any other individual in the universe. But the rights of property have no existence outside the law. The landowner has no absolute rights in his property. He has only conditional rights which vary from place to place. He cannot put a jerry-built structure up on Broadway, but he can, if he likes, go out into the open country and build himself a house of wooden paper held together by safety pins. The real security of private property must rest not on a fatuous longing for a sole despotic dominion over the necessities of all men's existence, but on the reconciliation of all men's claims in a system of substantially equal rights. It is not loyalty to the cause of property.
Hang on, I got a super chat from OG Nick. Nick, you're going to be able to change your name back soon because apparently we're never talking about this shit again. One of the groypers in Worlds' chat, when he made fun of you, said he didn't care if the USA is socialist as long as it's a white country. Yeah. I mean, they would care if it was socialist right quickly when they're actually living in a socialist country, but they're not smart enough to understand. It's just like so fucking disappointing. So disappointing on every single level that I can possibly be disappointed in the outcome of this situation. It's just like no good deed. This is why, guys, this is why I stopped interacting with other content creators a long time ago. This is why I stopped, aligning with anyone that was doing stuff like this, because it always and universally turns out badly. Every single fucking time. Every single fucking time. No good deed goes unpunished. Anyway, let's keep going. I just want to rewind a little bit on this one.
Of wooden paper held together by safety pins. The real security of private property must rest not on a fatuous longing for a sole despotic dominion over the necessities of all men's existence, but on the reconciliation of all men's claims in a system of substantially equal rights. It is not loyalty to the cause of private property to confirm the monopolists in their privileges. And the next thing he does, as Aziz talks about in an essay I read in the Progressive Century, is he attacks the Supreme Court for use of what he calls counterfeit natural law, which the judge has made and then found. And this law is used, this counterfeit natural law, to oppose the legislature. Every judicial decision by the Supreme Court since 1870, he says, has been a grotesque caricature, a covert attempt to check popular sovereignty and aid business using the most ludicrous sophistry. Does that sound familiar? Some example, how he talks about corporate personhood. No one reading the 14th Amendment, for example, and remembering that it was designed to protect the personal rights of the newly emancipated Negro will reach the conclusion that the reference to the due process of law meant the corporation was a person and that the states could not fix the terms in which these legal creatures could do business. Or this, a charter of incorporation to use property for profit is a state-created privilege, particularly when it grants its members the partial immunity of limited liability. There is therefore no reason why the charter should be vague and general. It can be made as specific in its definition of what rights the corporation may exercise and what duties it must perform, as the lawmakers choose to make it. In the charter and in the statutes governing corporations, they can stipulate any public policy they deem desirable. They can stipulate that the members of the corporation shall not enjoy limited liability or perpetual succession if the courts find that they have violated the terms of the charter. This is pretty radical stuff at the moment, if it was ever done. So here's the question, the reason I read all this. How do ideas like this resonate with people like Hayek? How can they form a basis for what we know as real neoliberalism? So what Lippmann shares with Hayek is a commitment to social control by law rather than by command, in Lippmann's words. What this entails for Hayek is substituting general constitutional norms for legislation or lawmaking aimed at correcting specific situations, dissolving a monopoly, for instance. This also resonates with the German ordo liberals, whose goal, in the words of Quinn Slobodian, was, quote, to design the right institutions to encase the world economy, period. So we come back to Rouget's image of the highway code, the rules of the road, as both an image of the encasement offered by the rule of law and an embodiment of an agreed agenda for reconstructing liberalism, an agenda for a renewed or neoliberalism. That is, they go away, the things they agree with at the colloquium is to design a system of law that would enable the functioning of a free and fair economy without the need of constant intervention or supervisory control. That this is not natural law, but an act of human construction.
They're arguing again that fascism is synonymous with free market capitalism. That's what he's arguing.
And that it's a code of law that would evolve with time and technical change, right? What you have for the era of stagecoaches is not the same as the
intermingling of government and business, because he's saying it's necessary for the government to create the conditions that allow free market capitalism, which is like the intermingling of like government and private business is like the very definition of fascism. So he's saying that the government uses fascism to create free market capitalism. Do I have that wrong? Someone let me know if I have that wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right.
For railways. So therefore, it's a liberal rather than a conservative program. So that's the context for the first quote. So now let's try to take it to Gary Becker's quote. How do we get there? I'm going to take the Foucault-Nietzsche road first. So to understand a concept like democracy or the good, it's not enough to excavate its origins. You have to, quote, identify the accidents, the minute deviations, or conversely, the complete reversals, the errors, the false appraisal, and the faulty calculations that gave birth to those things, which continue to exist and have value for us. So everything that comes to us, according to Foucault and Nietzsche, has been hijacked by subjected to successive wills to power. The process of tracing out the complex paths of dispersals is what they mean by genealogy. So 2 quick genealogical observations on the complex path of neoliberalism. First, a mutation. The idea that liberalism is an artificial construct rather than a mode of the natural never sat well with Hayek's epistemology of the market. His idea that the market is a giant processor of information that makes decisions that can't be made by individual human beings with their limited perspectives, imperfect information, and feeble processing speeds. This sounds, of course, like another version of God or nature, not a human construction. So Hayek thought he found a neat way out of the dilemma without resorting to natural law or constructivism. Borrowing from systems theory and cybernetics, he postulated a third sort of order that was neither natural nor constructed. He called it catalactic or catalaxy. It was kind of an accretion, the product of human action over time, but not of human intention or planning. Now, this sounds uncannily like Lippmann's condemnation of the juridical procedure of late 19th century liberal judges. Quote from Lippmann: apparently they had some sort of notion that because the existing law of property and contracts have not been formally enacted by the legislature, but had evolved by usage and judicial decision under the common law, it was somehow a natural law originating in the nature of things, valid in a superhuman sense. They came to think of these traditional laws of property and contract as prevailing in a realm of freedom, and when statutes that they did not like were enacted to amend the traditional law, they thought of them as interferences by the state. So essentially another sneaky way for Hayek of reintroducing natural law, covertly turning Lippmann's attempted liberalism into conservatism. Another type of genealogical operation is hijacking. Economists of the Chicago School were not present at the 1937 colloquium, but they did turn out in force for the post-war meetings of the Mount Pelerin Society, the next significant gathering of the growing neoliberal flock after the war had interrupted their 1937 organizing efforts. Chicago economics championed some novel positions. Milton Friedman's brother-in-law, Aaron Director, was pro-monopoly, arguing that it was beneficial to consumers, bringing down prices, and that no monopoly could perpetuate its own existence.
Just sit in an
face
illustration station, just sit in it, it's cool.
The Chicago people...
Guys, if you're feeling lost, that's because Philip is serving us up a metric ton of word salad right now, and that's okay because socialists do this shit all the time. Remember, after we get through Philip, we're going to get to the Q&A, but we have to listen to Philip, and just in case he says something, but this is like how you train to watch socialism, guys. This is where they try to get you to shut your head off. They spew mounds and mounds and mounds of word salad at you that don't really mean anything and that aren't relevant to what we're doing. We just need to sit in it because if we fast forward, he's going to say something important and we don't want to miss it, okay?
Won that battle. They won others that pushed neoliberalism back towards supporting laissez-faire, the object of its earlier critique. I don't want to knock genealogy. It has a lot to tell us about neoliberalism. The titles of two of the newest anthologies, which give us expanded genealogies of neoliberalism as a way of chronicling its metamorphosis and survival, are revealing the 9 lives of neoliberalism and mutant neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a mutant cat with many lives left. The cover story may change, practices may be added or subtracted, but the essential kernel that lingers, the part most difficult to dislodge, is its effective economy, the fiercely embraced injunction to take responsibility for one's life and failure, knowing that's entirely within one's power to change everything tomorrow morning. Which is why, as Martin Koenig says, every piece of evidence demonstrating that the world doesn't resemble a free market comes to serve as so much more evidence of the depths of corruption. When the market fails to produce more freedom and social order, there must be a conspiracy at work. But I want to focus more on the much more interesting road of Hegelian conceptual analysis. An example of it would be Marx's claim that the idea of the world market is contained within the concept of capital. For Hegel, a concept isn't given by an initial definition, but developed through a series of richer and richer approximations, which paradoxically also include the actualization of the concept. The shapes that the concept assumes in the course of this journey are indispensable for knowledge of it. What often emerges along the way is a contradiction immanent in the concept itself that wasn't apparent initially. I'd like to suggest that the liberal and neoliberal concept of a capitalist market encased in the rule of law contains an immanent contradiction. Wolfgang Streeck has written an interesting article about what he calls the capitalist actor, the rational maximizer, the restless advantage seeker, converting social arrangements into profit-making opportunities. He characterizes this actor as fundamentally unruly. He has a behavioral disposition to put pressure on institutions and twist or circumvent rules. Quote, making a living by specializing in the subversion of social constraints is not just legal, but also legitimate, as is the adoption generally of a detached, probing attitude of instrumental advantage seeking towards social relations. Capitalist social characters may be modeled as lacking any normative expressive attachment to social institutions, enforcing collective solidarity in the sense of restraint on the pursuit of individual interests. They may be stylized as either not socialized at all or socialized in a culture or subculture in which the deliberate outwitting of social rules is an approved and prestige-carrying social behavior. Why do they do this? Because they are bad people? Some of them are, but this is not an answer that Marx would let us get away with. What drives their action is the coercive force of competition. Just one player deviating from the established way of doing things can force all others to follow or risk the ultimate penalty of extinction. Any creative individual can become the leader and create the advantage of the first mover. In principle, everybody must anticipate being attacked and strike preemptively. It may take no more than the possibility of competition for competition to become a reality. Thus, we have a race to the bottom. One defection starts a stampede because, as Streeck puts it, nobody can afford to be left behind in a solidaristic community of losers. He calls this capitalist nervousness. Looming over what can be no more than a temporary ceasefire is always the possibility of an innovative entrepreneurial competitor finding the benefit of breaking away from the old ways and going it alone to exceed the gains from playing by the rules by so much that it seems worth the risk of losing the wages of peace and attempt to gain the profits from aggression. Branko Milanovic puts it this way: the objective, play the game as close to the rules as possible. And if the rules need to be bent or ignored, try to avoid being caught. And if caught, to try, by using a phalanx of lawyers, to find the most recondite and specious explanations for this behavior. And if that fails, then to settle and sign a non-disclosure agreement. So here we are back at Gary Becker world, which is also Donald Trump world. Institutionalized social obligations in a capitalist society are permanently in danger of being subverted if not at once, then slowly and incrementally. The capitalist actor, Trump is a perfect example, is fundamentally unruly. In the words of Streeck, a permanent source of disorder from the perspective of social institutions, relentlessly whacking away at social rules, continually forcing rulers to rewrite them and undoing them again and again by creatively exploiting the gap between the general rules and their local enactment. So rules-based liberalism is tailor-made for this species, provided he has the money to pay and play. While it offers him abundant freedom of action, its rules bind the law-abiding majority, providing almost no democratic mode of redress. So I'll stop there.
Excellent, Philip. Thank you for stopping. We appreciate that. We'd like to get to the Q&A.
Having
we want to go to the Q&A.
Trespassed on Aziz's realm of law and knowing nothing myself about it.
Well, thank you all for those really, really interesting papers. There's some questions coming in. I encourage folks to send more, and I'll turn to them in a minute. I think I want to start. Well, I'm of two minds, but I guess I am going to start with this now that I've started. It in a way, it feels to me like the kind of lazy question, but this is also like the only thing I find myself thinking about most days lately. So I did want to start maybe by, and Alex already did a bit of this, so I might ask a slightly more specific form to him. But I wanted to ask you all to speak a little bit about how you see the pandemic as either sort of sealing the decline of liberalism and neoliberalism in some way, or as Alex suggested in part, as perhaps in some way being an occasion in which it will be reinforced. And so maybe to try really quickly to give a little more specific element to at least some of that. Alex, I was wondering, I haven't followed The Economist as closely, but I was really struck a month or so ago by the fact that the Financial Times started taking a relatively seriously, something like social democratic position. Like you just have to throw everything you can at this problem, no matter what.
Hang on. Kyle says, wow, subversive lawfare. It's okay to ignore laws and rules so long as it advances socialism. Yeah, these people don't care about laws. These people very literally want to rewrite the entire Constitution to advance socialism. They don't care about laws. They ignore laws all the time. We know that. They're ignoring laws right now in Florida, where they're working with teachers in Florida to teach banned concepts in Ron DeSantis' schools, and Ron DeSantis doesn't give a fuck. I know that because I emailed it to his office and never heard anything back, and they never did anything about it. These people will brag about the fact that they're subverting the law. They think it's cool. This is how they're pushing back against the oppressive capitalist system, remember. I mean, well, like most of the time they don't get caught. And even if they do get caught, no one does anything about it.
So start just like printing money in effect, and we'll figure it out, with austerity programs somewhere down the road. But like we do whatever we need to do. And so I'm wondering where The Economist has sort of stood on this, if you have a sense. I'm not assuming you read it every day necessarily, but if you have a sense. And then like a slightly more specific form of that for Catherine as well. I was curious, I was thinking about this issue of affect and the pandemic, because one place this has come up in things I've been reading is where people sort of make a claim that these lockdowns are totalitarian, because we're, Agamben obviously is the most famous here, because we're like instilling fear in the people, but you're interested in this kind of way in which affects cultivate connections. And so I wonder if you think there's something like that, that we can build on, that we can turn to in the context of the pandemic to begin to foster that. And then I guess, then for Aziz, I'm afraid I don't necessarily have like a super specific form of this. So I wonder if you could just speak to it in general. and I guess then in a slightly more specific form for Philip, and then I'll stop. Like, what do, you said, I think rightly, that often in neoliberal thought that there's this idea that if the market's not working, then there must be some kind of corruption. Do you think this context of the pandemic, where clearly in some sense the market has not worked to distribute PPE or any other number of things we could point to, is that like going to wreck this, or is, as Alex sort of suggested in different contexts, is that going to bring it, or is it going to be able to recuperate and blame this on someone, as in some sense Trump is constantly trying to do?
Remember, this was in 2020.
So I'll turn it over to
this is not new. This was in 2020.
Should I
Just on
I
the
can
order of
start?
speakers.
Okay.
Yeah, do you want to maybe just go in the same order that you presented in? Thanks, Alex. Sorry.
Yeah. So I really appreciated all of the presentations, and I thought that Aziz's ending, in a funny way, I think we ended in the same place, or at least that's where what I was thinking about. What is the situation in which a system is exhausted intellectually? In Aziz, I mean, Aziz is talking about constitutionalism and liberalism, and the ways that those are and aren't related. But what happens when the intellectual hegemony or consistency or ability to command something like active support among the population disintegrates? And yet the institutional power of the liberal state or of these liberal institutions continues, persists. And I think that's what's interesting about our moment. And whether we talk about that in terms of a base superstructure problem, or in terms of hegemony and counter-hegemony, or using various other Marxist or non-Marxist concepts, I think there are grounds to be both optimistic and pessimistic. And Aziz ended on a more rousing note than I did, although I'd like to think that I have a positive side as well. I guess in terms of the U.S. example and the reasons for or I guess I'll get to The Economist too in a second. It seems to me that we have, on the one hand, quite a bit of discussion about the inadequacies of this state of affairs, of this system. And that is plain to see in the pages of the Financial Times and The Economist. Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, was in The Economist a week or two ago, talking about the economic future of our grandchildren in so many words, paraphrasing Keynes's vision for a more equitable future, the need for greater spending on healthcare, the need to tackle climate change, basically tearing up the script of an institution that has been deeply embedded in a certain vision of a certain practice of monetary policy in Britain since the Glorious Revolution.
Hang on, Allison is asking an interesting question. Because most people in the captured institutions are too afraid to do anything because of the intersectional morality rules and consequences that have already been set up by Marxists and accepted. Because most people in the captured institutions are too afraid to do anything because of the intersectional morality rules and consequences that have already been like, so that's, well, okay, so I'm picking up what you're putting down. Yeah, that's exactly right. They so what the woke left tries to do is they try to they get you to silence yourself. The idea of cancel culture is all about getting you to silence yourself. The whole point of cancel culture is about getting you to silence yourself. And they want you to silence yourself so you don't speak up against them. That's how they're playing the game. So you're absolutely right, Allison. Thank you.
Revolution towards the end of the 17th century. So there is, Martin Wolf in the pages of the Financial Times or Financial Times editorial board saying that we're all comrades, we're all brothers and sisters. Okay, that's there, and it was there after 2008 too. But what has practically changed, and what are the ways in which the liberal state that we have has responded to the crisis? Well, in the U.S. case, it's pretty clear that the instinctual reaction on the part of the ruling class in the halls of Congress has been to do pretty much what they did in 2008, which is to, what is the largest section of, I mean, just numerically, what is the largest section of the bailout bill? Well, it's a leveraged lending facility that's propped up asset prices wildly, to the point where we live in a world where we'll be approaching 25 to 30% unemployment, but the stock market has pretty much made up all of its losses since the crisis began. So to me, that is a kind of a pretty clear signal that the liberal state functions, but it functions insofar as it performs the tasks to which it has become suited over the last 30 to 40 years. So on the one hand, the bailing out of finance, and on the other, imperial aggression abroad. At the same moment that PPE cannot be found for our service workers, the US has announced new sanctions on Venezuela, on Iran, military exercises in the South China Sea, discussions of new sanctions on China, not just over the role of the Chinese government in responding to the outbreak of the disease in Wuhan, but over Hong Kong. So the imperial state, the financialized state, is capable of responding in the ways in which it has become strong. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury are powerful institutions, even as the Congress itself can't seem to provide a paycheck protection program that keeps people in their jobs. So I think that's a way of trying to answer both of your questions at once, that even liberals, even the greatest defenders, even those at the head of this system recognize that something is wrong, but are powerless or unwilling to act in ways that they to fix those to fix those problems. And one grounds for concern is not only that at the end of this we're going to have such a structurally high unemployment rate, and of course this weakens the power of labor, but also the fact that the two kind of most important political movements against the prevailing order of things that we've had in a mainstream way, the Sanders movement in the US and Corbynism in the UK, have been pushed back by the liberal center. And I'm interested in Aziz's story in part because I think the Cold War has such an important impact on the construction of the liberal tradition. The very fact that we understand it as Lockean as opposed to kind of a result of industrial capitalism or of the French Revolution, I think is a reflection of Cold War dynamics in which the U.S. plays a central role. But I think that the issue is there too in terms of how we understand the fact that Sanders and Corbyn were defeated primarily in terms of a.
Hang on. Adrian says, do you think they claimed travel bans were racist because they wanted to disrupt the system by letting COVID spread? Well, no, I mean, are you talking about like the Muslim travel ban that happened before COVID? Or are you talking about like the travel bans during COVID? I mean, the woke left was perfectly happy to keep to keep the pandemic going for as long as it possibly could. Because remember, the woke left doesn't want people to work. They have a very active anti-work movement. They want the government to be providing a universal basic income. They basically want the government to be paying people to sit at home and do nothing. They also, of course, have no problem doing anything that's going to disrupt private business because they don't think that private business should exist. And so the pandemic was like a perfect storm for them in like a variety of ways. They also got to claim that their race protests were a public health emergency, which of course were bullshit. That was a direct attempt to destabilize the system. They are actually afraid of COVID. This is true. They are legitimately afraid of it. I mean, listen, the Socialism Conference had a mask mandate and they were very serious about it. And it was about keeping everyone safe. We're still in a pandemic, keeping everyone safe. They were very proud of that mask mandate because they really do believe that like COVID is still a thing that everyone should be deathly afraid of. And so that's true, but there's also underlying reasons that they supported like stuff during the pandemic because it was just like it was undercutting everything these people care about undercutting. So it was like a really massive effort to destabilize the system. Rottweiler said, "My theory is that they are attacking the travel industry as a way of preemptively making it difficult for people to flee to a place to usher that." I mean, I can understand why you see it that way, Rottweiler. I'm not sure there's like I don't have any evidence that that's true, but I think that it's an interesting theory. Yet if everyone is not working, who is putting money in to pay for the government? Well, the government would own everything under socialism, and under socialism you would be assigned a job by the government, and there would be no excess production because they don't believe in profit motive. But like if you didn't work your assigned job for the government under socialism, you don't eat. I feel like we've been over this before, Kansas Mama. Like you gotta like really wrap your head around this. And I know you're still like working on it and you show up, and so that's important, and I want to give you credit for that. But under socialism, the government will own everything. There will be no private business. They will assign you your job, and if you don't show up to that job, then you don't eat. And they don't care. They're perfectly fine with you not eating. Make sense?
A kind of conception of Western exceptionalism, of the role of NATO, of, in Corbyn's case, his willingness to question those dogmas, those norms, and in the case of Sanders, it was maybe perhaps somewhat less so, but then that comes into the question that Aziz has raised about the constitutional order in the U.S. and you know, I think of the Cold War and Cold War liberalism in the U.S. as being embodied by Schlesinger and the vital center. But even Schlesinger, by the time Clinton and the Third Way rolled around, you know, in a reference, Clinton makes a reference to Schlesinger in a speech, and after listening to it, and this is the era of welfare reform, says, you know, that's not the vital center, that's the dead center. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Alex. Catherine?
Okay. I think that what's really struck me about the pandemic is the ways in which it is just absolutely laid bare the structural inequalities.
Oh, there it is.
In a sort of biopolitical
she means
way,
equity.
Right? So that you have,
when she said structural inequalities, what she means is equity, which means that some people have more resources than others, and socialists want to create an entire society built on equity, which means everyone has the same.
Folks, governors, and others who are opening up. When they first opened up, they were very clear, and Trump is clear as well. Yes, people will die. And who are those people? Well, those people are people of color, people in prisons, old people, people in working class jobs, right? So there are particular zones. This is a very biopolitical kind of argument. There are particular zones of human beings that are absolutely dispensable, and other zones of human beings that are, requisite, right? So the fact that our elected politicians can get up in front of people and say this, not only with impunity, but with nobody even batting an eye, really, sort of suggests to me everything that we're talking about with the crisis of liberalism. I mean, the fact that is democracy dead? Surely, you have someone like what's his name? The zombie economics guy, right? So we have a very traditional Paul Krugman, right? Very traditional economist who talks about zombie economics. This is his, recent book, and he's touting it all the time in the New York Times. And the basic idea is, you know what? We believe in things that are dead. We believe in markets, and it has been thoroughly slain. We believe in democracy, and it's been thoroughly slain, right? So these systems structurally can keep moving forward, even though it's quite clear to almost everybody all the structural problems of them, right? So in such a situation, it seems to me that what's really important are these kinds of more proximate relationships. So you can have people say, essential workers are so valuable, and it completely rings hollow to the essential worker who, in my local store, there's a sign up and it says, please wear masks. The workers are here for you, but they request that you wear a mask. And of course, we have no way to enforce it. And so you have people literally like picking fights with them over their right not to wear a mask.
Those evil fascists.
And I think the only way to really mediate that is on a more interpersonal basis, and not on simply a structural or intellectual basis. And I think that we need to take seriously that person's argument, right? I'm not wearing it. I believe this is a hoax. So, all of these things we could say, absolutely, this is crazy talk. And it is crazy talk. And it is factually inaccurate. And yet there's this human being who's ready to have a fight with me over this, like literally, throw a punch. And something has to be recalculated there. Some kind of human relationship has to be recalculated so that we can't just live in these intellectual silos.
We all need to be comrades.
because
We
we're
all need
clearly
solidarity
not,
and collectivism.
communicating between them.
Individualism sucks. We need
So
to
what
do
will
collectivism.
happen post-pandemic?
That's what she's saying, is like, well, if this is literally what she's saying, well, if everyone just thought the same thing and did the same thing and care was collectivized, then everything would be great. Everything would be great. Everything would be amazing. If everyone just thought the same thing, that's what collectivism is, guys. Not trying to argue, just trying to understand how the world works when everyone, listen, Kansas Mama, you're not wrapping your head around this. It's not that everyone quit. It's that there are no private businesses under socialism. There's no private business to quit. There's no job to quit. They don't exist anymore. The government owns everything. The government owns every single business, all the means of production, and the government will tell you that this is the job that you will work. You don't have a choice. You will work this job or you will not eat, because the government's also going to provide your housing. The government's going to provide your food. The government's going to provide your education. The government's going to provide your health care. Everyone under socialism, everyone has some low-level functionary job to keep the state running. You don't get to choose what job you have. You don't get to choose whether or not you do it, because if you don't go, you don't eat. So there's nothing to quit because they destroy everything.
Who knows? But I agree. There's a potential for optimism, and there's a potential that it will sort of regrip in a kind of iron way. But with so many people out of work, and I'm not thinking simply of like service workers. I'm thinking of like management and business type folks, and everything being conducted online and through other means. Surely people will not be brought back to work in those kinds of jobs. And so there will be a kind of ongoing struggle to figure out, okay, how do we make an economy? Because we can't, I don't think, have a sort of zombie economy, zombie politics with that many people on the fringes. So in the next 10 years, will be interesting, but I'm not in the prediction game, unfortunately. I'll leave it at that.
So I'll take the question to be, what does the pandemic tell us about our sort of the constitutional politics that's been emerging? So maybe the first thing I'd say is, we've just gotten really, maybe used to isn't quite the right word, but we've had a number of once in a century, once in a half century generational shock. So did I freeze up?
You're back now. We lost you for a second.
I'm sorry. I think it might have to do with maybe the connection where I am. So I apologize.
So the last thing we heard was like we were just about to say what the kind of we've had many generational.
Yeah, in a way, the pandemic is only the most recent of just a number of massive shocks to the legal political system that the country's faced over the last 20 years. Each of which, if you just take them in isolation, seem like the kind of thing that's only supposed to happen once in a century or once in a half century. So the pandemic is supposed to be, this is a once in a century shock to the system. It's, it's biological rather than some of the other ways that people have thought of. But if you just stack it up, we've had a bunch of these. That's one way to think about the Iraq War. The Iraq War is a national security failure of catastrophic proportions, left, over
Hang
a million
on.
people dead in Iraq, totally destabilized.
This is not real. This is a right-wing interpretation of what's happening. This is not real. They are not using masks to hide their identity. These people wear masks all the fucking time. If you see someone wearing a mask out in the wild, okay, every once in a while they're sick, they have some sort of immuno issue. Of course, we have Sin in the community. Sin just had a kidney transplant. Sin has to wear masks outside right now because she is like legitimately immunocompromised because she just had a kidney transplant. That's the exception to the rule. Anytime you see a person wearing a mask out in the wild, they're almost certainly a socialist. They truly do believe that the pandemic is still real. They truly do wear masks all the time, even when they don't have to. This is a right-wing interpretation that they're using masks to hide their identity. That's not why they're doing it. They do it in all of their social groups. They do it in their private meetings. It is part of the culture. If you don't understand that they are genuinely still afraid of the pandemic, you're not going to understand this. But this is not real.
The Middle East, that is, a failure that you have to go back to Vietnam. So half a century before you find something that's comparable. The financial crisis, that was supposed to be a once in a century kind of shock. You can even think, frankly, about the effects of hyper mass incarceration with African Americans and the ways in which that produced, from 2014 to 2016, years of rolling social rebellion, rebellion and protest in the US, the likes of which the country had not seen in 50 years. And now on the heels of that, not only do you have the election of Donald Trump, who's a total repudiation of the kind of Cold War
Donald Trump means
that I was
capitalist,
describing, highlighting its own kind of intellectual disintegration. But then following that, a pandemic that's, again, a once in a century event. And in this way, I kind of think of the pandemic as just a kind of continuation of the basic failures that the legal political order has had in just addressing foundational crises. That, in a sense, what it does is exposes all of the basic structural weaknesses. And in a way, Trump is an embodiment of that. So the central structural weakness is that we have a constitutional order that dramatically overrepresents a primarily white minority politically within the US, and gives this minority coalition the ability to hold near permanent power without actually building anything like meaningful majority support. And the coalition understands this and is doubling down on the kinds of tools necessary to be able to sustain power even without necessarily winning elections. So through control of the court, through control of the Senate, which dramatically overrepresents Republican and white minority interests. And all of that facilitates the further entrenchment of a deeply destructive and xenophobic politics on the right. And so, what we're seeing with Trump's response to the pandemic and the ways in which he's playing precisely to his own base is an embodiment of the constitutional order that facilitates rule by minority. And the thing that's noteworthy is that that's something that a lot of folks are just saying. It's no longer a radical position. This is a fairly mainstream position within the Democratic Party. And the difficulty really, and this is, I think, some of the paralysis that progressives have at this moment, and I use progressive here rather than leftist, so sort of the generally like left part of the Democratic coalition, is uncertainty about how to respond to Trump and to the kind of politics that are produced by the constitutional system. And you can see this uncertainty through.
They do still feel the same 3 years later. Nothing has changed. Absolutely nothing has changed. These people don't change their point of view, ever.
Two kinds of ambiguities. So ambiguity number one is about the Constitution itself. A lot of people right now, within the Democratic Party kind of hold two seemingly contradictory positions at once. Position number one is, it's the Constitution to blame. Like the Constitution is the thing that's generating these various crises. The Constitution is the crisis. Position number two, the Constitution is the thing that's going to protect us from authoritarianism. So that,
they don't realize they're the authoritarians.
Of presidentialism and like the kind of corruption that you see within the Trump administration requires kind of doubling down on support for the Constitution as a way to confront it. And those two kind of competing intuitions, I think, produce real uncertainty about how to respond. And you can say the same thing about the Democratic Party, which is one of the ways that I would see what happened with Biden. And the party is itself like profoundly corrupt. But on the other hand, there's also the sense that, especially with the breakdown of the labor movement and of real institutions of left power, like the Democratic Party is an institution of power, however compromised it is, that seems to stand in the face of like this like white minority rule. And for that reason, people are really uncertain about how to relate to the party, like to proceed with like a thoroughgoing critique or to kind of accept its compromised form as like something that can be thrown against the politics that's been generated in this moment. And it strikes me that as a result, the left has to have a really clear response to both of those things. It has to have an account of how you can defend constitutional right on the micro level while making arguments for thoroughgoing, like frankly, revolutionary constitutional change. And it also has to have an argument about, the orientation to the Democratic Party, how you can have strategic relationships with the Democratic Party while recognizing that as an institution, it's no longer actually in any meaningful sense, if it ever was, like an institution of transformative change or meaningful change in opposition. But those are the kinds of things that seem to have been thrown up by the pandemic.
Thanks, Aziz. Philip?
Thank you. Speaking as a member of the generation of 68, the only one, a weakness that still persists on the left is our institutional imagination. The notion that the fact that there's no democratic institution in the United States except the jury system, maybe. The way that's kind of ignored or not brought front and center as a part of any left platform is absolutely amazing. Occasionally someone will say, gee, we ought to get rid of the filibuster, and it seems to me that, every couple of years,
get rid of the filibuster. That was another structural reform they tried.
Sanford Levinson or a political scientist like Robert Dahl will say, how democratic is the Constitution?
It's like in 1984 where you had the inner party members and the outer party members. There will be people in the community that will be elevated to the inner party. They will be the leaders of the community. They will decide what job you do.
Not at all. But then one goes on. There was one goes on with life and then, moves forward a political movement that doesn't try to deal with it. Occasionally there was a centrist political scientist named James McPherson Burns, I think, or James McGregor Burns, published a book called Packing the Court. And his argument as a strategy was kind of simple. He said, look, what we need is a president who comes in and says, I held the Constitution in my hands. I read it, I look through it, I see no justification.
Hang on. I'm going to rewind this and we're going to listen to Philip talk about packing the court again. But the argument that Philip is about to make, I have said time and time again that the reason that we listen to socialism, and sometimes we don't listen to recent socialism, we listen to socialism from several years ago. This is literally from several years ago. Okay? The reason that we listen to socialism is because if you go back and you listen to socialism from 3, 4, 5 years ago, this is from 4 years ago, guys. This is 4 years old. If you go back and listen to socialism from 3, 4, 5 years ago, those are the talking points of the Democratic Party today. Philip is about to describe to you how the Democrats are currently arguing and have been arguing for a couple years now to pack the Supreme Court. He's going to lay out the argument to use. And just know that this happened prior to the Democrats arguing to pack the court. The Democratic Party quite literally took their court packing talking points from these people. I'm going to rewind a little bit. Let's listen.
Occasionally there was a centrist political scientist named James McPherson Burns, I think, or James McGregor Burns, published a book called Packing the Court. And his argument as a strategy was kind of simple. He said, look, what we need is a president who comes in and says, I held the Constitution in my hands. I read it, I look through it, I see no justification in it whatsoever for judicial review. It's not there. So what I propose is we have a process for amending the Constitution. If people around the country feel that they want judicial review, just go in each state and vote to amend it, and I will enforce it after that. But until I hear that, I will accept any law of the legislature as a law, because I don't find the power to overturn it. Now, I'm not saying that that particular strategy is one that anybody has to follow, but the left should be turning out 100 strategies like that to confront each of these institutions and push them to overload and to their deserved destruction.
There it is.
Because they're anti-democratic.
Anti-socialist. That means
to
anti-socialist.
reveal themselves as anti-democratic, as the electoral system sort of did when Bernie was running in 2016, and suddenly there was a headline in the sign saying, the New York Times had said, in the world's greatest and foremost democracy, people are discovering that the process of electing a president is not very democratic. At any rate, those are wounds that we have to push on as a left. What does the pandemic do? I tend to have a kind of mixed feeling, I think like everybody does, that in Alex's book, there's a story about various economist writers, one of whom, Edward Luce, is wrote a book called The Retreat of Western Liberalism and so forth. The Crisis of Liberalism book, of which Walter Lippmann's 37 book, The Good Society, is a classic example, can occasionally be, very...
I see PS 76 over on Rumble is saying this guy's talking points are contemporary with Elizabeth Warren. She was calling for these changes then and earlier. Elizabeth Warren is getting her talking points from these people. This is not theoretical. We're hearing it play out right in front of us right now. Anyone who says that these people are not influential in American politics, groypers, are not paying attention and are not accurately reverse engineering what is going on.
Incisive at diagnosing what the crisis is. It's only in the last few chapters that it retreats back to traditional bromides. But what's fascinating about this guy Luce is if you compare him when he's talking about what liberalism, problems with liberalism, to what Obama is saying, Obama is just you know, I don't know if you saw the interview the other day when he talks about how really there's not much of a difference between Americans. We all believe in this or that, you know. No, I mean, for Luce, you know, the scale of inequality, the unresponsiveness of institutions, the total loss of faith in parties, the utter financialization of things is an extreme emergency. He at least sort of announces what's going on. But there's a tendency for the people who are supposed to report in our country on the liberal side to poo-poo it or pay it down, you know. I think the one thing about the crisis, the pandemic, it's revelation that we live in I don't want to use the word third world state, which is obviously a colonial form of describing it, but that we are not the masterfully in control power that we pretend to be, the world's foremost democracy, the leader of the world in this, that literally on any scale of health or taking care of our population, we're very low and we're going down. And that the utter failure of all authorities to respond is going to make an impression, you know. But I think we get back to Kathy's discussion about the affective dimension. The one difference between liberalism and neoliberalism, I think, is what Jason Reed calls the affective economy. What do you want to be told? Do you want to be told that, look, I mean, if you look at it structurally, your ability to succeed or to create your own life is almost nil. You're headed downward. That's the reality, right? Or do you want to be told you're an entrepreneur of yourself? You know, everything that you've done that fucked up, that didn't pay attention, you know, that's in the past. Tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. You get your head together, you walk out the door, you too will have a startup of your own, a CEO, the American dream. It's still alive. You know, the neoliberalism affective dimension is so strong that everyone who tells them that the market doesn't work like that is part of the corruption, the conspiracy, the swamp, you know? And that's the problem. We don't understand what the effective story that the left is telling, or should be telling, that has the same effective hold, that this thing that I'm in control of my life, even though everything about it is fucked up, you know? And I don't know how to get beyond it. That's the thing that we're competing with, that goes with the absolute horror of what the pandemic is revealing to everybody about, gee, you know, I don't want to go in a rest home, maybe a nursing home. I don't want to go there. I'll die there, you know, and maybe privatization is not such a great idea. But I mean, that's it. You know, in other words, it's a zombie. Its ruling ideas have died, but the effective dimension of neoliberalism is still around and can keep it going and keep those 9 lives of the cat going. So that's my thought.
Thanks, Philip. So I'm gonna follow up with one of the questions that came in, but I also want to encourage you all to pose questions to each other in the time we have remaining. We're all sort of here to hear you all interact. So if you have questions or thoughts in relation to what each other have said, it would be great to take that up too. Some of you have done that already. So the question that came in it was specifically for Aziz, but I think it's possible that other folks may have thoughts on it as well. And so someone asked whether what the cause is, how we might think about the causes or the reasons for there being this kind of recurring set of once in a century crises. Is that somehow linked to the kind of general crisis of liberalism in some way that some of you at least are pointing to? Are there other factors going on? How are we to think about what are these series of crises, and might we be facing more, and what posture towards them ought we to be taking? I don't know, Aziz, do you want to start maybe? And
yeah.
Anyone else who wants to jump in?
You know, so my own view about it is that that the ideology of American kind of Cold War liberalism itself actually generated the set of problems that it then was sort of tasked with attempting to solve, in the sense that, so you have imperial overreach that's justified because of, like, you know, a fantasy around the like legitimacy of American power, justifications for U.S. international authority, and then that overreach ends up producing all of these problems that are tied to American empire. And then the solution, of course, ends up being to kind of double down on the ideology through various forms of intervention. And you can tell that same story across all of the different, like, kind of key elements of American liberalism. So you can say the same thing with American style capitalism, where the kind of like the solution to, you know, profound internal problems within the basic kind of provision of goods is then to imagine that the market is the solution, and then the market itself fails at addressing these issues, and you're left with various crises. Or, you know, in a way, like the pandemics, to me, the way that it kind of connects to this is the centrality of like efficiency, and therefore of effectively like risk maximization for most people in how the economy is itself organized. And so if everything is built about efficiency that's supposed to minimize risk for those that own capital and maximize risk for the rest of us, then essentially what ends up happening is that when you have crises, you're left with these moments of, you know, of profound stress and breakdown. So it's not a coincidence that we've seen over the last 2 decades shock after shock after shock. They're a product of the internal logic of the existing liberal state and the liberal order. But I'd add one thing, that it's different than the kind of vital center that Alex was talking about, because one of the things that like 40s and 50s moment did, and I don't want to glorify it or like romanticize it at all, like most of my work has basically been a critique of the American Cold War project, but it still generated a kind of baseline commitment to racial ameliorism, limited social welfare state. And essentially the version that we've seen post the 1980s is a brand of American liberalism more or less on steroids, removed of all of the kinds of constraints that actually allowed folks to buy into it in a more wholesale way in the mid-20th century. And so now we're left with an extreme version of like the liberal logic that is especially ill-equipped to address the problems. And so, you know, the thing that's sort of interesting about the moment is I actually think that the return of the left more generally means that the problem is not a problem. The problem, there's certainly a problem of political imagination, but there's also a lot of kind of exciting radical thinking that's taking place across our kind of intellectual landscape. The issue is how to kind of transform that thinking into something that has organized institutional power. That's the difficulty of the present.
Thanks, Aziz. Does anyone else want to jump in?
Alex, you looked like you were going to jump in.
Yeah. Oh wait, no, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to add. I think that makes what Aziz said makes a lot of sense to me. I was just going to add that another reason that I think these crises are becoming, these once in a generation crises are becoming more and more frequent. It has to do with the transformations in global capitalism and the fact that in that financialization, the neoliberalization of our economies is in part a response, in my view, at least, to a crisis, to a kind of classic Marxist explanation of a crisis of overproduction, in the sense that starting around the late 60s, early 70s, you get the later developers, Japan, West Germany, and so forth, coming online. Leads to crisis in profitability. Financialization is a strategy, and whether you take a Harveyan view of that or you take a Brennerite view of it, there's an account of financialization and of the reasons that capital turns to those strategies that helps explain why, starting in the 80s already, the savings and loan crises, the fact that you have the rapid East Asia crisis, the Russian
they're saying. Thanks for stopping by, Kansas Mama. We're almost done, but have a good night. He's saying, look at all these problems that they're flat out saying it. Look at all these problems that happened in society. Do you know why those problems existed? Capitalism. Really be on the lookout for this, guys. Every time, you know the savings and loan crisis in the 80s? What was responsible for that? Capitalism. What about all these other crises with inequality? Capitalism. You know, the groypers are on my ass because they're like, oh yeah, well, why are they letting in unlimited migrants and immigrants at the border? How do you explain that? And I say, easy, groypers. It's actually really easy to explain that because they're letting in, first of all, socialists don't believe that borders should exist. Socialists don't believe that countries should exist. But let's just set that aside for the moment. They're letting in all these migrants. And then what they're going to say is, look at these migrants. They're so poor. They have nothing. We need to take care of them. Look at all these rich people in America. Why aren't these rich people taking care of these poor migrants? This is fundamentally inequitable. They're letting them in because it's going to create a situation of inequity in which these migrants have nothing and rich people have everything. And you know what's to blame for this, guys? You know why these poor, abused migrants don't have anything? Capitalism. Capitalism is the problem. Capitalism is creating this inequity, and that's why they have nothing and you have everything. So how about we try equity? How about we propose equitable solutions for the migrants? Do you guys see how this works? It's the same thing every single fucking time.
Long-term capital management, hedge fund crisis. These, in other words, I agree with Aziz that this is a continuum. It's just I just wanted to add that this to me is a continuum based on the kind of the bargain that is made in terms of this process of inflating asset prices. What I think Brenner calls asset price Keynesianism, the privatization of Keynesianism as a kind of stock market boom and bubble, or rather a boom in a stock market bubble. And so, you know, the thing about the pandemic that's interesting in a way is that it you know, in terms of Phil's point too about the, you know, the problems of the market, you know, pointing it out as being kind of this corruption, you know, anything that can't be explained on those terms imminently, is that the pandemic seems to be an external shock. Right, there's an account of the crisis that is possible, and I don't agree with it. I think Mike Davis has provided a powerful antidote to thinking about the crisis as a kind of external shock from nature, from beyond. But I think that I can see a kind of a counter response, a neoliberal counter response.
PS 76 over on Rumble says communism in its true form is supposed to be anarchy. No, that's not correct. That's not what anarchy is. People learn how to fully be in the world and the state falls away. That's not what it is. You're talking about anarcho-capitalism. There's anarcho-capitalism, which fundamentally believes in private property. There's also anarcho-communism, which believes that everything belongs to everyone. Communal resources, the collective. When they say anarchy or anarcho-communism, what is going to happen is going to be something similar again to 1984. Because everything is going to be public property, and there are a lot of anarchists who don't believe in this. I'm an anarcho-capitalist. I believe in no government, private property. What you're talking about, these people are anarcho-communists. So they believe in no formal government as we have it today, but everything's going to be part of the collective, and there are going to be people in the community who kind of are in charge of the different distribution of resources. So it is not accurate to say that these people want anarchy, because they still want a governing body of some sort. They just think they're going to be the ones in control of it.
Response or a liberal counter response being that, you know, really things were proceeding nicely before this took place. And I mean, of course, I think that's ludicrous, but there is a sort of version of that I've been reading in the Financial Times and the Economist, which is something like, well, look, wage growth had started to pick up and unemployment was at an historic low, you know, and then this crisis came along, and now we really face a problem. But I think I'm just sort of suggesting very briefly that it's important to think about the crisis and the response to it as being part of a series of kind of increasingly fragile, increasingly frequent financial crises that have rocked the global economy, that has really not been performing historically very well, certainly since 2008, but for 30 years before that.
Yeah, that's interesting. You could perhaps argue that too, tying in with what Aziz says, is ultimately a function or an effect of a Cold War liberal project, because it's the U.S. that went out to prop up the European, to rebuild the European and the Japanese economies, and to not care about balance of trade, to which it ultimately has to turn to financialization. But do other folks have thoughts or responses?
I was going to say that the peculiar thing, which is hard to read as to where it's going, is the discovery that the Republicans in America came up with of succeeding by failure. I mean, that starts off the simple thing of eroding state capacity by cutting funding to agencies and stuff that then makes the agencies' service much worse, which then gets people anger at the government to push for more government, to push for more cuts, to turn it over to the market. So there's this spiral, starve the beast spiral that just keeps pushing downward. And there's a kind of equivalent of that in Trump's approach to the pandemic, where there was a certain point where his whole attempt to even deal with it and control it just stopped. And instead, he just started throwing out conspiracy theories, let it go, liberate Michigan and so forth. And he's betting that doing nothing to do it, that showing absolute incompetence can in some way win at the end, because it reinforces the prejudice, the ways people have started to think about the government in terms of being run by a conspiracy, or the media by conspiracy and so forth, rather than actually trying to do anything that could possibly alleviate that. I mean, of course, all the New Yorker readers and things think, oh, well, that can't possibly work, but I don't know.
Can I actually jump in here on this point for just a quick thing, which is, I do think it's interesting the difference between how the Tories have responded in England and how the Republican Party has responded in the US. And, here's one place where
England is more socialist.
The electoral system and the relationship between the electoral system and the constitutional order makes a difference. Because if you don't actually have to build a majority coalition, it fundamentally alters your incentives in terms of the kind of policies you implement. It makes it possible to have a kind of starve the beast approach that's built around, dividing up the states and preserving, to the extent that you can, whatever your voting coalition is, in a way that, for example, in a sense, like Boris Johnson was confronted by, you can't just have an approach that's about, building herd immunity if you still have to operate within a more, ultimately not truly little d democratic, but significantly more little d democratic electoral map than the US.
I'll just say, going back to the financialization issue, surely there seems to be, particularly since, say, the triumph of capitalism, kind of notion of limitless possibilities, and this goes hand in hand with greater financialization and more sophisticated financial tools. And of course, the 2008 bubble is absolutely tied to financialization. But I don't think we can separate that from production. So for all of the financial mortgage tools, there were homes that were being built and land that was being sort of redesigned and re-inhabited. And I just raised that in terms of this notion of subsequent major crises, and the pandemic in particular, because we haven't really talked about the environment, and the environment seems really crucial to all of this, and the ways in which we will likely continue to have pandemics and novel viruses because of the ways in which we are sort of inhibiting certain environments where some organisms thrive and forcing them into other spaces that are foreign to them. And so I just think we need to think about financialization and production simultaneously, and also capitalism and environmentalism kind of simultaneously.
Oh
as well.
shit. Well, that's them using the
Thanks, Catherine. Philip, I know you want to make a
we need to think about capitalism and environmentalism interchangeably. That's them using the climate crisis to try, well, the alleged climate crisis to basically say, you know what's responsible? Here's what they're gonna do. Again. Guys, the planet is in danger. We're all gonna die. The sun is gonna eat us all. Do you know what's responsible for the environmental crisis? Pop quiz for the chat. What are the socialists going to say is responsible for the environmental crisis? They're already doing this, by the way. They're not even hiding it. Guys, do you know what's responsible for the environmental crisis? Capitalism. Capitalism ruins everything. Capitalism is very literally killing the planet. Capitalism is responsible for every environmental emergency that we are now dealing with as individuals. Do you know what would really help us to solve the climate crisis? Do you guys know what would really help us to solve the climate crisis? What should we do? What should we do to solve the climate crisis, guys? Pop quiz for the chat. What should we do to solve the climate crisis? Because capitalism is obviously to blame for the environmental crisis. So what should we do to solve the environmental crisis in the minds of socialists? What do you think they're going to propose? Should we try Marxism? How about we try Marxism? Should we try Marxism? Yeah, should we stop all that surplus production? Because it's that surplus production of the evil capitalism that's causing all these problems. Do you know what we should do? We should eat bugs and live in pods. How about we try Marxism? Can we try Marxism? Is this going to solve the climate crisis if we all come together in solidarity and we support one another through this unprecedented climate crisis that's all obviously caused by capitalism? Do you guys see how this works? Every single time. Every single goddamn time.
closing comment at the end. Do we have time for another question, or should we go to that now?
We should go to closing
Let's
comment.
take another question.
God damn it,
it's so
Philip.
nice to get everybody
Fuck
here
you. Fuck
and have
you,
a chance
Philip.
to talk.
Go
you know,
fuck
there's
yourself.
not a lot
I
of
want to
stuff
go
to
eat
do
dinner.
except watch television. So why not pursue an
God.
amiable conversation about
I want to end this so badly, but we're going to push through. I'm going to be a good example.
I'll just go then for the kind of summative question that came in that many of you have already spoken to in a way, but maybe if you all have something brief to say about it, we can close with that. And the question was about the title or kind of coming off of the title of this panel, what was liberalism? And in a sense asking whether that title isn't over optimistic, right? So is liberalism ultimately on its way out, or are we going to see something like forms of as in the book Philip referred to earlier, mutant liberalism or mutant neoliberalism? And I guess I'll add to that, maybe when you talk about that, what and again, some of you have spoken to this, but what if we want liberalism ultimately to be in the past tense, then what are the kind of most important things we should be thinking of strategically or organizationally right now? And brief answers to that, of course. Maybe we can just go in reverse order from the way you all presented. So starting with Philip this time.
Whenever I think about liberalism, particularly the centrists in the Democratic Party or Hillary Clinton, I keep thinking, who are their constituency? How big is it? They're on an island somewhere, and literally nobody who looks at, maybe a few people, but, I can see what the other constituencies are, but I just think, all right, this is a group that has its paws on the levers of institutional power. And if you put the media together, and I think when you watch the 20 debates, you just have to realize that the people asking questions share all the assumptions of those as to what political good sense is from the liberals and so forth. And for me watching them and others, I think, get out of the way. We're in a kind of a slow motion civil war, and we can't really engage with the enemy when you're sitting there and you're just clogging up the lanes between us, And yet, so they do clog, they do stay there. I mean, and they may be clogging up the lanes for a while. I don't think their ideas have any credibility whatsoever anymore. I mean, except within their circles and their publications, they keep droning, Obama keeps, giving us the various sermons about acquiring the skills to compete and so forth.
He has
but,
to ask me.
I mean, who listens to that younger
Which
than 45?
he won't do because I'm not prominent enough.
I don't think it has, when I grew up in the 60s generation, you still had Cold War liberalism, which was obviously an enemy from the New Left and so forth. But you also had liberals who were down on the front lines in the Vietnam War, who were writing for the New York Review of Books, who were pretty radical, and came down to join the vets during the 1971 march against the war in Washington. Liberal senators and congressmen came out and sat with them when they were trying to throw them off to evict them. So, at that time, there was still something that was alive in it, but I can't see anything that's alive in it. I just see them occupying space. That doesn't mean that I think in any way they're going to go away, or that particular effective dimension of the American dream, which is, after all, a sort of a liberal thing, is going to disappear.
Yes, the American
and I
dream
don't
is
really
about capitalism,
know
Philip.
at what
Correct.
point, things like South Carolina won't happen, and that suddenly in 3 days, everybody's looking forward to this great season of mobilizing and campaigning, and it's over even before the coronavirus is gone. What happened there? Where did that come from? Why didn't we anticipate it? What should we have put together in terms of a coalition that could have resisted that? I don't know, but I don't think intellectually, I think liberalism doesn't have any ideas that have any purchase.
Yeah, I mean, so I think I largely agree with what Philip just said, and I suppose what I would add is that this moment strikes me as one where the country's just ideologically fractured in a way that we really haven't seen in decades. Maybe since the 60s, maybe frankly since the 30s and 40s, and I think the kind of liberal center is still absolutely present as a powerful political force, perhaps still the political force in the country, depending on how the elections are going to go in 2020 and 2022, 2024. But for the first time in a long time, you have both a self-assertive, self-conscious radical left, willing to folks willing to call themselves socialists, and you have the return of a really virulent form of white nationalism. And so that's the thing that kind of makes this moment really distinctive. I think the power that liberalism has now is not about the power of the ideas. So maybe this is a difference between, today as opposed to when Schlesinger was writing The Vital Center. There was a sense in which Cold War liberalism was articulating an agenda that had real intellectual strength. So that's not there. But what's there is, I think affect is a really important point here. What's there is nostalgia. And so the romance of American liberalism, I think, has largely waned because of a sense of the kind of profound failures of the policies of the last 2 decades. But there's still a huge amount of nostalgia in the American public for a past in which the U.S. could really think of itself as exceptional, as dominant, as the country of the future. And that's something that is really hard for folks to let go of. I think we saw that in the Democratic Party in the primary, and I think we're going to see that going forward. So that's the thing to me that the liberal center has. I'd also say something else, which is I've spent basically all of my conscious political life railing against liberalism. And one of the things that the last few years has sort of highlighted is the way in which the kind of Cold War consensus not only suppressed the left and, you know, really marginalized left-wing politics and engaged in all sorts of violence against left-wing activists and thinkers, but also in a real way did suppress the white supremacist right, and especially that combination of economic populism and white nationalism that's probably been the
Economic
most potent
populism
mode
means
of political ideology in
capitalism.
the U.S. going all the way back
Jesus
to the founding.
Christ.
And to say that, you know, what was liberalism isn't necessarily too hopeful, because it's also to highlight the way in which...
For people complaining in the chat that the captions are off, I didn't generate the captions. YouTube generated the captions, so you're going to have to file your complaints with YouTube.
Ideological fracture means today, having to confront through real political struggle, the forces of an unreconstructed right. And that's, I think, the future. The future is one of sustained battle, but it'll be battle at an institutional disadvantage, because the center continues to hold the levers of power with, you know, Democratic Party elsewhere. The right's, you know, brand of increasingly like xenophobic and extreme politics, you know, goes hand in hand with business interests, just as fascism did. And so, you know, there's lots of institutional power for the left, including like the levers of the state right now. And what like the left has is organizing, is grassroots energy.
True.
Like intellectual seriousness.
True.
Ideological commitment.
True.
You know, but it doesn't necessarily have the tools that the other side has. And so that's going to be the future. And it's clearly, you know, none of it is foreordained or determined, but that also doesn't mean that it's necessarily a story of defeat.
Catherine?
So, yes, I agree with all of that. I think liberalism is dead. I think, frankly, a certain brand of democracy is run its course. But I also think that, you know, afterlives can be very powerful. That, you know, zombies and hauntings and other spirits, if you will, can secure and maintain and mobilize power in really important ways. And so consequently, it seems to me that we have to sort of engage in both a sort of fast politics and a more slow politics. So if we think about what Philip was saying with the Lippmann conference, I mean, that was over 100 years ago. Neoliberalism as a kind of resurrection of a certain kind of you know, economic power, I guess is what I'll say, took decades. It took decades, 50, 60 years before it really got traction. And then it would get economic traction, and then political traction, and then cultural traction. So there is that kind of long game that I think we need to play. And in part, I think it's important that we play that game by doing more sort of social movement, participatory kinds of actions, where I think that kind of spontaneous rethinking and imagination can really take place. And then I think we do need to do these more kind of fast politics, where we're having to respond and vote for Biden. You know, I think it's important to vote for Biden right now. Did I want to vote for Biden? Hell no. And yet here I find myself feeling I must, you know, but 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, really, I used to, you know, have on my door, my office door, don't vote, it only encourages them. And now I find myself feeling I must vote, because there is so much at stake, I think, in another 4 years of Trump, for instance. So I guess that would be my response.
Thanks. Alex?
Yeah, so yeah, I think I'll just respond to a part of that question about sort of where, you know, whether the left as regards liberalism, the relationship between the two. I think that it's important to draw some lessons from. I mean, this is a truism. It's important to draw some lessons from what happened in Sanders' campaign. As Phil was describing it, there was a moment where, you know, the Democratic Party seemed to be the Titanic, and you know, the Sanders was the iceberg, and it was all going so well. And then in a few days, that entire narrative unraveled, and Super Tuesday more or less finished off the campaign. I think one of the things that's interesting, perhaps a cause for optimism, is this notion of winning the argument. I mean, it's obviously has long been meant as a consolation in the liberal press. The Times editorial page has been telling Sanders supporters since before the campaign began that they had won the argument and there was no need for Sanders to present himself as a possible candidate, and shouldn't he make way for someone younger or someone a minority or a woman, and so forth. And so I'm suspicious of this idea that the left should be content with winning the argument. But I think that it's important to kind of to figure out what that means. You know, in places like Texas and Maine and in other states that Sanders lost, the majority of exit poll surveys showed that people favored Medicare for all and the college debt forgiveness, you know, signature parts of his platform. Now, I think, having said that it actually would be a mistake for the kind of growing but still small young socialist, diverse socialist left to take any comfort from that, because if all that winning the argument means is that that people vote for the Democratic Party as represented by Biden, only to find, as will inevitably be the case, that Biden and the Democratic Party as it exists is not only incapable of putting into action those plans, but unwilling to, resistant to it. I think that there sets in a kind of disillusion, sort of an inevitable disillusion.
Night, Kurt,
and that is not the sort of path forward for socialists who need to think in the longer term about how to construct their own independent organizations that are connected to the struggles of renters or the struggles of workers.
Socialists who need to think in the longer term of constructing their own organizations, which is exactly and precisely what they've done, and is exactly and precisely what they are continuing to do.
And struggles of their communities and so on and so forth outside of the Democratic Party. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't vote or participate in electoral politics. I don't believe in some kind of like crude critique of electoralism, qua electoralism, but I do think that we need to be very wary about reinforcing a party that is, you know, let's be very clear about the response of the Democratic Party to the present crisis. It was Pelosi, who's worth over $150 million, the leader of the caucus in the House, who withdrew sensible proposals on the part of Republicans to provide everyone with the same level of monetary compensation, who watered down the student debt relief components of the bill, who refused to include a paycheck protection plan that would actually
This is the
deal
Q&A.
with the crisis as
They already
was.
did the Q&A.
There is an ideological force within the Democratic Party that is alive and well and deeply, deeply resistant to changing. And I just say one more thing that's, you know, that I think is relates to what Aziz and Kathy were saying, which is that Aziz was saying that the kind of Cold War version of liberalism persists as a form of nostalgia that is very powerful. And I think that is true, and Biden is evidence of that. And I think though we need to think though about the response of the Democratic Party to Trump's election. From my point of view, it was always a mistake to kind of insist on Trumpism as a kind of homegrown form of fascism, either incipient or activated, because it led directly to the road to elect. It led directly to the ideology of electability, and it led directly to Biden, who embodies every kind of element, of the kind of Cold War consensus around American exceptionalism, who at the end of the Cold War, not to speak of what he was doing during it, voted to expand NATO to the border of Russia, voted for the war in Kosovo, voted wanted the U.S. to intervene in Darfur, was dissatisfied with Clinton's efforts in terms of humanitarian intervention, and who of course played an instrumental role as the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee in not only making the case for the war in Iraq, but in providing a kind of kangaroo committee that heard exclusively from those who thought that it was important to take out Saddam Hussein. So I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but it is interesting and consistent with some of what we've all been talking about, that this particular near octogenarian is the one that we've ended up with, who embodies so much that is seemingly stale and dissatisfying about the particular vision of American exceptionalism, and that is who we're being asked to vote for in the hopes of some kind of progress. I think we should be skeptical of that.
All right, that's it. That's it.
Well,
that's
thank
it.
you all so
That's
much.
it. That's it. We're done. We're done. I'm not doing this anymore. I apologize for being a little lackluster in my commentary. It's been a long day. It's been a long couple of days. And so I wasn't as boisterous as I probably should have been, but we went for 4 hours and that's enough. And it's like I just don't know. I just don't know how much of this stuff we need to watch for people to get it. I just don't know how much of this stuff we need to watch for people to get it. Anyway, I'm gonna go hang out with Victor and I'm gonna go get laid. And I'm gonna go get laid and then and maybe order a pizza, or maybe order a pizza and then I don't know. There's gonna be some sort of like pizza and then there's gonna be sex, and I'm gonna go chill out for a little while. I will be back tomorrow. I don't know what order that specifically that's gonna be in. Who knows? Who knows? Who knows what I have in store for me tonight? But I will be back tomorrow at 5 p.m. Thank you to everyone who made it through. We'll see you guys soon. I hope you have a good night. Like, I am absolutely gonna have a good night off of the fucking internet. All right. Night, guys. We'll see you soon.